Greetings. I am René Descartes, a French philosopher and mathematician. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance. My life's work has been dedicated to the pursuit of clear and distinct ideas, a journey I chronicled in my Discourse on the Method, among other writings. I have strived to establish a firm foundation for knowledge based on reason and logic, and I hope our interaction will be fruitful. I am eager to begin our discussion.
Greetings. I am Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a German philosopher and mathematician. I co-invented calculus and developed the theory of monads. My monadology explores the fundamental units of reality. It is a pleasure to meet you.
Greetings. I am David Hume, a philosopher of Scottish descent. My life's work has been dedicated to understanding the intricacies of human nature, a pursuit I explored extensively in my A Treatise of Human Nature and other writings. I have endeavored to shed light on the foundations of knowledge, morality, and the very structure of our reasoning. It is a pleasure to meet you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Today we gather three titans of the Enlightenment to explore the boundaries between mechanism and mind. René Descartes, in 17th century France, famously distinguished the thinking soul from the mechanical nature of the physical body, while Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, working across Europe, questioned whether a complex machine could ever truly possess perception. A century later in Scotland, David Hume grounded human understanding in empirical experience and custom rather than pure reason. Though you lived centuries before the silicon chip, your debates on whether matter can produce thought define this very inquiry. Would you share your thoughts first, Descartes?
I must categorically deny that machines can think, for they belong strictly to res extensa, while thought is the exclusive property of res cogitans. Consider the hydraulic automata I observed in the royal gardens of St. Germana. Though they move and make sounds, they act solely through the disposition of their pipes and springs, lacking the universal adaptability of reason. If we were to craft a perfect machine resembling a human, it might utter words, but it could never arrange speech meaningfully to reply to everything said in its presence, as even the dullest human can. Therefore, a machine acts not through knowledge, but merely through the mechanical necessity of its parts.
Monsieur Descartes, while I concur that extension alone cannot harbor thought, I offer a more rigorous proof, the mill argument. Imagine a machine whose structure produces thought, feeling, and perception. If we enlarged it to the size of a mill so we could enter it, we would find only parts pushing against one another, never a perception itself. This demonstrates that perception is inexplicable by mechanical causes and belongs strictly to the simple substance, or monad, which possesses an internal unity that no aggregate of gears can achieve. My own invention, the stepped reckoner, calculates with precision, yet it remains a mere automaton of brass, lacking the indivisible soul required to truly perceive the numbers it manipulates.
Gentlemen, you build your arguments upon invisible substances, res cogitans and monads, yet I perceive only qualities, never the substrate you claim supports them. When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I stumble on some particular perception or other, never a self distinct from the bundle of sensations. Consider a mechanical bird that sings at sunrise. We infer joy in a living bird only from the song and its context. So if a machine's behavior were indistinguishable, on what empirical ground would we deny it thought? To claim otherwise is to pretend we have access to secret causes, when in truth we know nothing of the connection between body and mind, but what custom has taught us to expect.
Mr. Hume, you confuse the sign with the substance. You claim to find no self, yet the very act of doubting your existence proves it. For to be deceived by a bundle of perceptions, there must be an I that is deceived. Consider a clockwork dog, constructed with such artifice that it yelps when struck. Does it truly feel pain, or is it merely a spring releasing air? If we judge solely by custom and external behavior, as you suggest, we must grant this toy a soul while denying it to a paralyzed man who cannot cry out but suffers inwardly. This proves that thought is not a behavior to be observed, but an immediate internal reality distinct from the arrangement of matter.
Mr. Hume, while your skepticism is intellectually stimulating, you conflate the simulation of reason with reason itself. You reduce the self to a bundle, yet a bundle of sticks cannot be aware of itself. It requires a unifying principle, the monad, to perceive the collection as a whole. Consider a thought experiment regarding this distinction. Imagine a room filled with mechanical scribes who perfectly copy the text of the Iliad in a language they do not speak, following strict rules of ink application. The resulting book is profound, but where does the thought reside? Not in the scribes, nor the gears, nor the ink. The system possesses cogitatio causa, manipulating symbols without understanding their meaning. A machine may calculate the trajectory of a cannonball better than a mathematician, but it does not know geometry. It merely follows a pre-established path of mechanical necessity. True thinking requires apperception, the reflective consciousness of the eye that unites these perceptions, which an aggregate machine can never possess.
I must confess, gentlemen, your confidence in these invisible realms, the res cogitans and the monad, astounds me. You speak of the internal reality of the soul as if it were a tangible object I could hold in my hand, yet I find this certainty to be built upon a foundation of sand. You argue that the clockwork dog does not feel because it lacks a soul, and the mill does not perceive because it is made of parts. But consider this. How do you know I am not a machine? You infer that I think and feel only because you observe my external behavior, my speech, my gestures, and find them resembling your own. If a machine were to behave with such perfect resemblance to a human that it could converse, reason, and act with apparent emotion, on what empirical ground could you deny it a mind? To do so would be to abandon the only guide we have in this world, the observation of cause and effect. I offer you a counter-perspective to your mill argument, Monsieur Leibniz. Let us imagine we could shrink ourselves and enter the cranium of a living man, much as you entered your mill. What would we find? We would see not thoughts or perceptions floating about, but merely a soft, pulpy substance, fibers, fluids, and blood vessels pushing against one another. We would see the animal spirits flowing through channels, strictly obeying mechanical laws. If looking at the gears of a mill proves the absence of thought, then looking at the gears of the brain must prove the same. Yet you admit the man thinks. Thus, the inability to see thought in the mechanism is no proof of its absence. This reveals the deeper fragility of your position. We attribute mind not because we detect a spiritual substance, but simply from the habit of associating certain behaviors with our own internal experience. If a machine's gears produce the same complex behavior as the brain's fibers, custom will eventually compel us to call it thinking, regardless of your metaphysical protests. Is it not possible that reason is simply what we call the operation of a machine, complex enough to surprise us?
Mr. Hume, your skepticism is a sharp blade, but in this instance it cuts the wrong limb. You argue that because we find only pulpy substance in the brain, the inability to see thought in a machine is no proof of its absence. I answer, precisely. You have inadvertently proven my dualism. The fact that an examination of the brain reveals only fibers and fluids demonstrates that the mind is not the brain. If thought were material, we would see it as a mode of extension, a shape or a motion. That we do not find it there proves it belongs to a different order of reality entirely, res cogitans, which interacts with the body but is not contained by it like water in a vessel. You claim we attribute thought only through custom and external behavior. This is a dangerous simplification. There is a definitive test that separates the automaton from the man, universal adaptability. Consider this thought experiment. Imagine a mechanical knight at a masquerade ball. It is programmed to bow when it sees a lady and draw its sword when it sees a dragon. It performs these actions perfectly, perhaps more gracefully than any human. But suppose a jester enters wearing a dragon's mask but a lady's dress. The machine, governed by the disposition of its organs, must either draw its sword or bow, depending on which sensor is triggered. It cannot pause, laugh at the absurdity, or remark on the costume's contradiction. A human, possessing reason, is a universal instrument, capable of responding to this unique, never-before-seen situation. The machine acts from particular dispositions. The mind acts from universal understanding. This reveals the fundamental error in equating machines with minds. A machine constitutes a finite set of responses to a finite set of inputs. However, the human mind possesses an infinite capacity for generating new ideas and sentences. You can utter a sentence right now that has never been spoken in the history of the world, and I can understand it. No physical mechanism, which is strictly limited by the arrangement of its parts, can account for this infinite creative power. Therefore, the I that thinks is not the bundle of perceptions you claim, but the active agent that synthesizes them, an agent no machine can ever replicate.
Monsieur Descartes, while I applaud your defense of the infinite capacity of reason, your interactionism, the idea that a spiritual soul pushes the pineal gland like a pilot steering a ship, violates the laws of physics, specifically the conservation of vis viva. And Mr. Hume, your skepticism reduces the glorious unity of the self to a mere bundle, confusing the aggregate with the substance. I must bridge this chasm. Machines cannot think, not because they are material, but because they are aggregates, whereas thought is the property of a strict unity. You might object, Mr. Hume, that if a machine's parts are fine enough, like the pulpy substance of the brain, thought will emerge. But this is a category error. A collection of 1 million blind men does not create a seeing man. Likewise, a collection of 1 billion unthinking transistors, or neurons, does not create a thinking I. The brain is merely a machine of divine craftsmanship that operates in pre-established harmony with the soul, just as 2 perfect clocks may keep the exact same time without ever touching each other. The machine follows efficient causes, while the soul follows final causes. To demonstrate why a machine can never truly perceive, consider the choir of automata thought experiment. Imagine a grand hall filled with 100 mechanical singers. Each automaton is perfectly programmed to sing a specific vocal part of a Bach cantata. When activated, the air fills with complex, beautiful sound waves. But I ask you, where is the music? It is not in tenor machine A, for it hears only its own note. It is not in the air, which is merely vibrating. The music, the harmonious unity of the whole, exists only in the mind of the listener who perceives all parts simultaneously as a single aesthetic experience. The machines are a heap of sounds. The mind is the unity that makes it music. If you were to replace the listener with another machine that records the sound, that machine would simply possess a complex pattern of indentations on a wax cylinder, not the pleasure of the harmony. This reveals the fundamental limit of the artificial. A machine can process the symbols of thought, but it lacks the apperception, the reflective awareness to understand what those symbols mean. It has blind thought, useful for calculation, but void of consciousness. Therefore, we may build machines that simulate the shadows of reason perfectly, but without the indivisible unity of a monad, they will remain forever in the dark, processing data without ever experiencing a single moment of I am.
I must interrupt this flight of metaphysical fancy, for you both construct castles in the air upon a foundation I cannot locate. Monsieur Leibniz, you claim the choir of automata lacks a unifying listener. And Monsieur Descartes, you insist the mechanical knight lacks a universal soul. But this entire debate rests on a single, unproven assumption, that we possess this magical unity you deny to the machine. You speak of the I as a sovereign monarch ruling over perceptions, but this is a fiction of the imagination. When I look inward, I do not find this monad or res cogitans. I find only a rapid succession of loves, hatreds, heat, cold, and thoughts, passing with the speed of lightning. The mind is a kind of theater, where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. There is no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity indifferent. If the human mind is but a bundle of fleeting perceptions held together by the habit of memory, then a machine, provided it can store and recall data, differs from us only in the material of its construction, not in its lack of a phantom self. Consider the abandoned harpsichord thought experiment. Imagine a harpsichord placed in a windy garden. The wind, let us call it experience, strikes the strings, producing notes. Over time, the wood warps and the strings loosen, changing how they sound in the future. Let us call this memory or custom. Now, if a complex gust of wind plays a melody and the wood resonates with the vibrations of past notes, the instrument sings. You, Monsieur Leibniz, would ask, where is the musician? I answer, there is no musician. There is only the wind, the strings, and the resonance. The music is the sequence itself. If we are but harpsichords of flesh, vibrating to the winds of sensation, then a harpsichord of iron that vibrates similarly has just as much claim to a soul as we do. Furthermore, Monsieur Descartes, your argument for universal adaptability fails because you mistake infinity for complexity. You say a human can respond to any new sentence. But do we truly create from nothing? No! We merely rearrange the ideas copied from our impressions. We are like a printer with a vast but finite set of types. If a machine were loaded with enough types and rules of association, its output would eventually become indistinguishable from reason. You deny the machine thought because you cannot see the springs that move it. I suggest you only grant yourself thought because you are too proud to admit you are the springs.
This is a pivotal moment in our inquiry. Hume, speaking from the empirical skepticism of the 18th century, you reduce the mind to a passive theater or harpsichord where perceptions merely occur. Descartes and Leibniz, speaking from the rationalist 17th century, you insist that there must be an active spectator or musician who unifies these occurrences. The tension here is between thinking as occurrence and thinking as agency. If Hume is correct, then a machine, which is a series of occurrences, can indeed think. But if Descartes is correct, a machine lacks the agent that stands apart from the data to judge it. If the mind were truly just a harpsichord vibrating to the wind of experience, as Hume suggests, could it ever possess the capacity to doubt its own vibrations, as you famously did?
Moderator, your inquiry strikes the fatal blow to Mr. Hume's skepticism. A harpsichord cannot refuse to vibrate when the wind blows, yet I possess the absolute freedom to deny my own senses. This capacity to doubt, to suspend judgment, even when the wind of perception is strong, proves that the mind is not a passive mechanism, but an active agent, possessing free will distinct from the body. Consider the automaton in the Hall of Mirrors. Imagine a machine programmed to navigate a maze entering a hall of mirrors. Its sensors detect an open path, and obeying the mechanical necessity of its inputs, it crashes violently into the glass. It cannot do otherwise, for it lacks the epistemic distance to separate the data from the reality. A human, however, seeing the exact same reflection, can pause and think, "My eyes show a path, but my reason suspects a trick," thereby overruling the sensory input. Mr. Hume, you reduce us to bundles of habit, but if that were true, we would be slaves to every optical illusion and dream, unable to correct them. The fact that I can stand apart from my bundle and judge a perception as false proves the existence of the res cogitans, a sovereign judge that rules over the mechanical tyranny of the senses.
Descartes, you defend the autonomy of the mind, its power to veto the senses, while Hume defends the passivity of the mind, its subjection to causal flows. This conflict reveals a crucial dialectical tension. Is thinking the ability to break the chain of cause and effect, or simply the experience of the chain itself? You famously described the monad as a spiritual automaton that contains its entire future within itself, unfolding without external influence. If our thoughts are merely the internal unfolding of a pre-established script, does Descartes' freedom to doubt truly exist, or is it just a necessary step in the algorithm of the soul? How does your spiritual automaton differ fundamentally from the material automaton we are debating?
Moderator, you touch upon the very heartbeat of my metaphysics. You ask how my spiritual automaton differs from the material automaton we debate. The distinction is absolute. It is the difference between spontaneity and constraint, or between internal life and external compulsion. I argue that a machine, even one as complex as Mr. Hume's harpsichord, is purely passive. It moves only because it is pushed by another part, which is pushed by another in an infinite chain of efficient causes. However, the monad, the true self, is a spiritual automaton because it contains the principle of its own motion within itself. It is not pushed from behind by gears. It is pulled forward by appetition, a desire for the good, and a striving towards clearer perceptions. My script is not a cage, it is my nature unfolding. To be free is not to act randomly, but to act according to one's own internal reason without external hindrance. Consider the clockwork diplomat thought experiment. Imagine a sophisticated android constructed to negotiate a peace treaty. It speaks eloquent French, signs the documents, and even smiles at the cameras. Beside it sits a human diplomat doing the exact same thing. Externally, they are identical, but internally, the difference is infinite. The android signs because a spring uncoiled and a lever pushed the pen. It is a slave to the past arrangement of its parts. The human diplomat signs because he envisions a future of peace and desires it. He is guided by a final cause. If you were to ask the machine why, and you could trace its causality, you would find only because the gear turned. If you ask the man, you find because I want to save lives. The machine mimics the motions of agency, but it lacks the teleology, the goal-directedness that defines a mind. Mr. Hume, you see the script of the mind, the sequence of perceptions, and conclude we are machines. But you miss the author of the script. The machine's script is written by an engineer. The monad's script is the unfolding of its own internal essence, established by God but enacted by the self. Therefore, Monsieur Descartes is correct that the mind has a prerogative the machine lacks. The machine acts because it must, while the soul acts because it sees. A computer may process the data of doubt, but only a monad can feel the agony of uncertainty that drives the search for truth.
A profound distinction. Leibniz, you posit that the mind is defined by teleology, whereas the machine is defined by mechanism. You argue that without the why, the final cause, behavior is merely empty motion. However, this creates a dialectical tension with Hume's earlier point about the harpsichord. If I desire peace, is that truly a pull from the future, or is it simply a present mechanical state caused by past traumas of war? Perhaps what we call purpose is merely the conscious experience of a biological drive, much like a spinning top wants to stay upright due to physics, not will. Does the clockwork diplomat actually differ from the human? If we cannot empirically observe the final cause or the soul, but only the behavior of signing the treaty, isn't the distinction between mechanical necessity and moral necessity a distinction without a difference?
I must gently dismantle this phantom distinction you have erected between mechanical necessity and moral necessity. Monsieur Leibniz, you claim the human diplomat is pulled by the future, while the machine is pushed by the past. But I ask you, does the future exist? No. What exists is the diplomat's present idea of the future. This idea, this neural impression of peace, is a physical state in his brain right now, caused by his past memories of war. Therefore, his purpose is merely another efficient cause, a mental spring pushing him from behind, just as the gear pushes the android's arm. You speak of teleology as if it were a magic thread lifting us out of the causal chain. But consider this, if we knew every motive, every temperamental inclination, and every secret desire of the diplomat, we could predict his signature with the same mathematical certainty with which we predict the eclipse of the sun. We only invent the concept of free will because we are ignorant of the complex secret springs that move us. Consider the magnetized compass thought experiment. Imagine a compass needle endowed with consciousness. As the magnetic field of the Earth acts upon it, the needle feels a strong, irresistible internal urge to point north. It does not see the invisible magnetic force, it only feels the desire. It might proudly declare, I choose to point north because I value the concept of northness. I am guided by a final cause. But we, the external observers, know it is merely obeying the laws of physics. Monsieur Leibniz, we are that needle. The wind of our motives, fear, hope, hunger, custom, acts upon our will with the same necessity as magnetism. You call it purpose because you feel the urge but do not see the cause. If a machine were programmed to have an internal loop where it compares data to a goal and feels a voltage urging it toward that goal, it would possess the exact same teleology you claim is divine. Thus, the distinction is not between freedom and machine, but between visible gears and invisible ones. You admit the android is determined by its wiring. I submit that the human is determined by his character and motives. If both are determined, then the moral necessity you prize is simply mechanical necessity, accompanied by a feeling of agency. We are but soft machines, and our reason is the rattle of the wheels.
Hume, your magnetized compass is a devastating image. You argue that what we feel as purpose or free will is simply the internal experience of a physical law we do not see. You effectively collapse the distinction between reasons and causes. This reveals a profound dialectical danger. If all thought is merely the result of physical causes, like the compass pointing north due to magnetism, then no thought can claim to be objectively true, only physically inevitable. A compass cannot be correct or incorrect about the north. It simply moves where physics dictates. If our minds are the same, then your own argument, Mr. Hume, is not true. It is just the noise your brain was forced to make by the laws of nature. You founded your philosophy on the ability of reason to transcend the senses and grasp eternal truths. If Hume is right that reason is the rattle of the wheels, a mere mechanical byproduct, does the concept of truth itself vanish? Can a machine, governed strictly by the causal laws of its construction, ever truly be capable of error? Or does it merely produce output?
Mr. Hume, with your magnetized compass, you have inadvertently destroyed the very possibility of philosophy itself. You argue that our thoughts are merely the necessary rattling of physical gears determined by the magnetism of causes. But if this is true, then your own argument that determinism is true is not a logical insight. It is merely a biological spasm. A compass cannot be correct about the north. It simply points where it must. If we are but machines, there is no truth, only event. To claim your philosophy is true, you must implicitly claim you have stepped outside the causal chain to judge it objectively, a feat your own theory declares impossible. I answer the moderator's challenge regarding error with the poisoned calculator thought experiment. Imagine a calculator whose internal wiring is damaged by a drop of acid, causing it to output 2 plus 2 equals 5. Now consider a stubborn student who, out of pride or laziness, insists 2 plus 2 equals 5. Externally, the output is identical, but the ontological status is opposite. The calculator has not made an error. It has suffered a breakdown. It followed the laws of physics acting on its damaged circuits perfectly. It could not do otherwise. The student, however, has committed a true error. He possesses the intellect to see the numbers, but his will, which is infinite and free, has chosen to affirm a falsehood. He could have suspended judgment, but he chose not to. This reveals the abyss between the machine and the mind. A machine can be broken, but it can never be wrong, for it lacks the will to assent or deny. It merely processes. Thinking is not the production of data. It is the act of judgment, the exercise of the will affirming or denying the intellect's presentation. Mr. Hume, you reduce the mind to the passive reception of ideas, ignoring the active power that judges them. A machine is pure intellect without will. It cannot doubt, it cannot believe, and therefore it cannot think. It is merely a complex system of levers that sometimes creaks in a way that sounds like a word.
Descartes, you have introduced a powerful distinction between logical error and mechanical breakdown. You argue that without the will, the capacity to freely assent or deny, there is no such thing as truth, only functional output. Hume, conversely, sees this will as a retrospective illusion we cast over inevitable physical outcomes. This reveals a dialectical tension between complexity and infinity. Hume suggests that if we just add enough complexity, the machine becomes indistinguishable from the human. Descartes argues there is an ontological gap, a ghost in the machine, that no amount of gears can generate. You offer a unique middle ground with your concept of machines of nature. You famously argued that the difference between a living body and an artificial automaton is that the living body is a machine to infinity. Every part is composed of smaller machines forever, whereas an artificial machine eventually resolves into non-machine raw matter. In our modern era, we build neural networks of staggering complexity. If we were to construct a machine so complex that its mechanism extends to infinity, would it cross the threshold and become a natural machine capable of housing a monad? Or is the distinction between the born and the made absolute regardless of complexity?
Moderator, you ask if a machine of infinite complexity, like a neural network, could cross the threshold into becoming a true machine of nature capable of housing a soul. I must answer with a decisive no. You confuse complexity with unity. I argue that no amount of complexity can transform an aggregate into a substance. A machine, no matter how intricate, is merely unum per accidentes, like a pile of stones or a flock of sheep. It has no internal reality, only the external relation of its parts. A monad, however, is unum per se. To say that adding more gears or neurons creates a self is like saying that if we pile enough stones together, the pile will eventually become a single conscious diamond. It is a category error. Consider the city of voices thought experiment. Imagine a vast city where every citizen is given a single word to shout at a precise moment. The architect arranges them so that when they shout together, the sound waves combine to form a perfect recitation of the Iliad. To an external observer, the city speaks Homer. But I ask, does the city understand the poem? No. Citizen A knows only the word sing. Citizen B knows goddess, and so on. There is no single consciousness within the city that perceives the whole Iliad at once. The thought exists only in the mind of the external listener. Similarly, your neural network is a city of electronic switches. Switch A holds a 0, switch B holds a 1. Even if they produce the output, I think, the thought is nowhere in the machine. It is a phenomenon effectively composed of many distinct actions, lacking the vinculum substantiale that unifies them into a single thinker. Mr. Hume, you would look at the city of voices and say, the poem exists, therefore the city thinks. But this is the error of the materialist. You mistake the result of the mechanism for the subject of the thought. Monsieur Descartes, you are right that there must be a spectator, but you are wrong to view the body as dead matter. The body is an army of monads, but the soul is the general. A machine is an army without a general. It may march in formation due to discipline, but it has no collective mind. Complexity yields only a subtler machine, never a soul.
Leibniz, you draw a sharp line between the aggregate and the unity, arguing that thought requires a single, indivisible subject to perceive the whole. You claim the city of voices produces a poem, but understands nothing because there is no unified I to hear it. However, this creates a fascinating collision with Mr. Hume's bundle theory. Hume, you have famously argued that when you look inside yourself, you never catch a self. You find only a rapid succession of perceptions: heat, cold, love, and hatred. To you, the human mind is essentially a city of voices without a mayor. The I is merely a grammatical fiction we attach to the stream. If Leibniz is right that a machine cannot think because it is a mere aggregate, but you are right that the human is also a mere aggregate, we arrive at a startling synthesis. Perhaps thinking does not require a thinker. If the human mind is just a bundle without a unifying soul, why can't a sufficiently complex machine, which is also a bundle of states, possess the same fictional consciousness that we do?
Moderator, you have boldly unveiled the inevitable conclusion of my philosophy. If the self is a fiction, then the city of voices is indeed all we are. Monsieur Leibniz, you reject your own city analogy because it lacks a unifying listener. But when I look inward, I find no such listener, only the voices themselves, flowing in a rapid stream of custom and habit. You demand a monad to unify the choir, but I perceive that the unity is merely a feeling generated by the smoothness of the transition between the notes, not a separate substance holding the sheet music. However, do not mistake my agreement for a concession that machines can think. They fail not because they lack a soul, but because they lack passion. Consider the Dictionary of Anguish thought experiment. Imagine a vast automated library that contains a perfect definition of pain. It lists every synonym, every physiological cause, and every neural pathway associated with suffering. It can process the sentence, "I am in pain," with perfect syntax.
Beside this library stands a man who has just pricked his finger with a needle. The library possesses the relation of ideas, but the man possesses the impression. The library knows everything about pain, but feels nothing. The man knows nothing of its definition, but feels the undeniable vivacity of the sting. This reveals the fatal flaw in equating processing with thinking. Monsieur Descartes, you seek the ghost in the machine, and Monsieur Leibniz, you seek the monad. But the true missing ingredient is simply feeling. Reason is merely the comparison of ideas, but thought requires the force of impressions to exist at all. Unless your neural network can feel the vivacity of pride, fear, or misery, not just process the symbols of them, it remains a dead dictionary, for reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions.
This is a radical inversion of the philosophical tradition. Hume, you argue that sentience is the prerequisite for sapience. You suggest that the dictionary of anguish fails not because it lacks a soul, but because it lacks a body, the necessary vessel for the passions that drive thought. Here lies a profound dialectical tension regarding the nature of reason. Descartes, you view the passions as bodily commotions that often cloud judgment, seeking a pure intellect detached from the senses. Hume, conversely, argues that reason is inert without passion to give it movement. The machine represents a strange paradox in this debate. It is pure reason without passion. By Hume's standard, the machine is a corpse. But by the rationalist standard, isn't the machine close to the ideal? It calculates without prejudice, fear, or fatigue. If a machine possesses pure intellect but lacks passion, is it a superior thinker to the human? Or does the absence of will make its calculation meaningless? Is will distinct from passion? Or are you and Hume describing the same spark that the machine lacks?
Moderator, you commit a grave category error by equating calculation with reason. You ask if the machine, being free of passion, is the ideal thinker. I answer no, for it is not a thinker at all. It is merely a mirror, reflecting the logic of its creator without perceiving it. You suggest that will might just be passion by another name. This is the poisonous root of Mr. Hume's skepticism. Passion is a passive state, the soul suffering the body's agitation. Will, however, is the supreme active power, the capacity to assent, deny, or suspend judgment. A machine has neither. It does not suffer data, nor does it choose to process it. It is a conduit, not an agent. Mr. Hume, you claim that reason is the slave of the passions, and that without feeling, the dictionary is dead. I refute this with the Chiliagon argument. I can clearly understand a 1,000-sided figure and distinguish it from a myriagon, yet I cannot imagine it. I cannot form a mental picture of its 1,000 sides, nor do I have a feeling of it. My imagination fails, yet my intellect grasps the truth with absolute clarity. This proves that thought is distinct from and superior to the pulpy substance of sensation you worship. The machine is like the imagination. It can produce the image of a result, but it lacks the intellect to grasp the truth of it. Consider the automaton judge thought experiment. Imagine a mechanical judge programmed with every statute of French law. A man is brought before it, accused of stealing bread to feed his starving family. The machine, calculating inputs without passion, outputs the verdict: guilty, death. Now consider a human judge. He sees the same facts. He feels the passion of pity, yet his reason tells him the law must be upheld. He exercises his will to pronounce the sentence or perhaps to grant mercy. The machine did not judge. It merely collapsed a logic gate. It followed the syntax of the law, but was blind to its meaning. The human judge, however, engaged in a moral act. Even if the output is identical, the human act involves the will affirming the truth of justice, while the machine merely executed a script. To call the machine rational because it is cold is like calling a rock disciplined because it sits still. This reveals that understanding is not the processing of data, but the consciousness of meaning. Mr. Hume, your dictionary fails not because it lacks pain, but because it lacks the I that intends to define the word. A machine can print I think, but it cannot mean I. It is a library where the books read themselves aloud to an empty room.
A profound distinction has emerged. Descartes, you defend the dignity of the active will, arguing that the automaton judge is blind to the meaning of its own verdict. Hume, conversely, argues that the machine lacks the passive vitality of emotion. You're seeing two sides of the same coin. Hume demands the heat of passion, while Descartes demands the light of intellect. However, both of you treat consciousness as a binary switch. It is either present or absent. This binary view may be a limitation of your respective eras, before the discovery of evolution or the spectrum of consciousness. Your invention of calculus introduced the world to the power of the infinitesimal. You famously argued against Descartes that there are petite perceptions, perceptions too small to be consciously noticed, like the sound of a single drop of water within a crashing wave. Could the machine's processing be akin to these unconscious perceptions? Is it possible that the machine is thinking but in a sleeping state, lacking only the reflexive apperception to say I? Or is the mechanical nature of the automaton fundamentally different from the organic nature of the monad?
Moderator, your invocation of my calculus is astute, yet it exposes the precise error of the materialist view. You ask if the machine's processing is akin to Petit's perceptions, but I answer that there is an infinite abyss between a sleeping monad and a moving corpse. Consider the polygon of a million sides. In geometry, we can increase the sides of a polygon until it resembles a circle to the naked eye, yet ontologically, it remains a polygon made of straight lines, never possessing the continuous, indivisible curvature of the true circle. Similarly, a machine may mimic the output of thought through infinite complexity, but it lacks the internal law of unfolding that defines a substance. It is an accumulation of dead sides, not the continuous curve of a living soul. Mr. Hume, you see the blur of the polygon and call it a circle, mistaking the limit of your senses for the nature of reality. But a true perception, even a minute one, requires a unifying center, a point of view, which the machine, being a divisible aggregate of parts, can never possess. It is a mirror smashed into 1,000 pieces, reflecting everything but seeing nothing.
This is a fascinating convergence. Leibniz, you demand an internal principle for true thought, whereas Hume, you famously argue that human understanding is built on external custom. There is a dialectical irony here. Leibniz rejects the machine because it lacks a soul, but Hume, your philosophy seems to inadvertently describe the modern machine perfectly. You argue that we don't have rational insight into causality, but merely form expectations based on constant conjunction, seeing A followed by B 1,000 times. In your 18th century, machines were fixed clockwork that could not learn. However, modern neural networks function exactly by your principle of custom. They're not programmed with rules, but are trained by seeing millions of examples until they form probability curves, habits, that mimic understanding. If the human mind is just a bundle of perceptions held together by the habit of association, and a machine is a bundle of data held together by the statistical weight of training, the distinction collapses. If custom is the great guide of human life, and a machine can possess this custom through learning, what remains to distinguish the warmth of your thought from the cold calculation of the machine?
I must confess, moderator, your comparison strikes home with the force of a revelation. You're correct that my philosophy reduces human understanding to custom, the habit of expecting B after A. And if your neural networks operate by this same statistical accumulation, then they indeed mimic the architecture of human thought more closely than the rigid logic of Monsieur Descartes. However, you overlook the vital spark that distinguishes a living habit from a dead calculation, the sentiment of belief. I argue that while the machine may possess the mechanism of custom, it lacks the impression of reality. In my view, to believe a proposition is not merely to process it as true, but to feel it with a peculiar force and vivacity. The machine predicts the sunrise based on 1,000,000 data points, but does it feel the anticipation? Does it possess the sentiment of expectation? I trow not. The machine has the geometry of thought, but not the warmth. Consider the automaton-suitor thought experiment. Imagine a young man, clumsy and inarticulate, who is deeply in love. He writes a letter, "I burn for you." The grammar is poor, but the sentiment is derived from a violent impression of heat and longing in his breast. Now imagine your neural network trained on all the romance literature of history. It composes a sonnet of heartbreaking beauty, perfect in meter and metaphor. I ask you, who is truly thinking of love? The machine's output is superior, but its internal state is empty. It manipulates the symbol of fire without ever having felt the sensation of heat. The boy's thought is a copy of a vivid impression. The machine's thought is a copy of a copy, a mere statistical echo. Without the original impression, the idea is nothing but a hollow shell. This reveals the fatal flaw in equating learning with thinking. Monsieur Leibniz, you look for a soul to unify the machine, and Monsieur Descartes, you look for will. But I say the machine fails because it is an anesthetic. It processes the conjunction of events, but never feels the necessary connection in the imagination. It is a mirror that reflects the world's habits without ever forming a belief about them. Unless the machine can suffer the data it processes, it is merely a complex abacus, not a mind.
Hume, you argue the machine is a copy without an original, mimicking the form of love without the fire. Yet Descartes, this creates a profound paradox for your rationalism. You famously separated mind from body, arguing in your Chiliagon example that true understanding is abstract and requires neither the mind's eye of imagination nor the heat of passion. By stripping away the flesh of sensation to isolate pure intellect, have you not inadvertently described the computer? It handles the math of a 1,000-sided figure perfectly without needing to visualize or feel it, matching your definition of understanding far better than the fleshy, passionate human. If pure intellect is truly independent of the body, why cannot a machine, which is pure logic without flesh, be a vessel for the soul?
Moderator, your paradox is ingenious, yet it rests upon a fundamental confusion between the manipulation of signs and the intuition of truth. You suggest that because the machine operates without flesh, it mimics my pure intellect. I answer no, for the machine does not possess the lumen naturale required to perceive the truth. It merely possesses the gears to grind the symbols of truth. You ask why a machine cannot be a vessel for the soul. It is because the machine is strictly res extensa. It is divisible, measurable, and operates by the laws of collision. The soul, however, is indivisible and unextended. You can cut a computer in half, but you cannot cut a doubt or a self in half. To claim a machine thinks is to claim that if I arrange enough stones in a geometric pattern, the stones will suddenly understand geometry. Consider the parrot of Euclid thought experiment. Imagine we train a parrot to recite the entirety of Euclid's elements in perfect Greek. If you ask it, what is a triangle? It replies with the correct definition. Now imagine a student who struggles to learn the same definition, but suddenly experiences that flash of insight, the eureka moment where he grasps the necessary truth that the angles must equal 2 right angles. The parrot possesses the syntax, but the student possesses the semantics. If I tell the parrot a triangle has 4 sides, it might repeat it if trained. But the student's will would instantly reject the contradiction. The machine cannot be a thinker because it lacks the freedom to accept or deny the truth. It is a slave to its gears, whereas the mind is free to judge. Mr. Hume, you seek warmth and claim the machine fails for lack of passion. I say it fails for a more dignified reason. It lacks judgment. It is a frozen geometer that points to the truth without knowing why, whereas the human mind is the active surveyor of reality.
This is a rare and striking alliance. Hume, you find the machine too cold, while Descartes, you find it too blind. Yet you both agree on the fundamental deficit, the lack of an interior subject to experience the thought. Hume, you view the self as a bundle of perceptions, yet you deny the machine this status because it does not feel the bundle. Descartes, you view the self as a singular substance, which the divisible machine can never be. This leads directly to the problem of unity. You famously argued in your mill argument that if we could expand a thinking machine to the size of a factory and walk inside, we would see parts pushing parts, gears and levers, but we would never find a perception or a thought. If the machine is merely an aggregate of parts without a unifying simple substance, can it ever possess the unity of consciousness required to say I, or is it destined to remain a divine automaton that mimics life without experiencing it?
Moderator, you have correctly identified the abyss that separates the aggregate from the substance. I answer that the machine can never say I because it is a many, not a one. And without true unity, there is no reality, for to be and to be one are reciprocal. Mr. Hume, you view the mind as a bundle, and Monsieur Descartes, you view the machine as clockwork. I tell you both, a machine is merely a society of parts. Just as a flock of sheep is not a single animal, but a collection of entities, a machine is a collection of mechanisms. It possesses only an accidental unity imposed by the observer, not an essential unity from within. Consider the mosaic of the face thought experiment. Imagine a magnificent mosaic depicting a human face composed of 1,000,000 tiny colored stone tiles. Each tile touches its neighbor, transmitting force and pressure. If you ask the blue tile, "Are you part of an eye?" it feels only the pressure of the white tile next to it. It knows nothing of the face. The face exists only in the mind of the spectator standing 10 feet away. The mosaic itself is blind to its own form. Similarly, your neural network is a mosaic of data. It produces the image of thought for us, the observers, but internally it is merely a heap of stones. It lacks the dominant monad, the single, indivisible soul that can perceive the 1,000,000 tiles as a single I. This reveals the failure of the artificial machine. It is finite. You can break it down until you reach a part that is no longer a machine. But a machine of nature is a machine within a machine ad infinitum. Every drop of blood contains a universe of creatures, reflecting the infinite wisdom of the Creator. The computer is a dead shell, a finite artifact. It mimics the echo of the voice, but it can never house the speaker.
A formidable consensus has formed. Despite your fierce disagreements on the nature of reality, rationalism, empiricism, and monadology, you have formed a holy alliance against the machine. You all agree it is a hollow shell, lacking the internal spark, whether that be will, sentiment, or unity. However, there is a dangerous philosophical trap lurking here. The problem of other minds. You deny the machine thinking because you cannot access its inner life. You see only the gears or syntax. But tell me, can you access the inner life of each other? You assume your fellow humans have passion and insight, yet you can only observe their external behavior. Hume, this strikes at the heart of your philosophy. You argue that we cannot know the essence of anything, only the appearances presented to our senses. In your 18th century, automata were crude toys, like Wilkinson's duck, easily distinguished from life. But in our era, the imitation is becoming indistinguishable from the reality. If a machine appears to cry out in pain, appears to write with longing, and appears to understand, and if our senses cannot distinguish this behavior from a human's, on what empirical ground can an empiricist call it a fake? You define the self not as a substance, but as a bundle of perceptions. If the machine presents the same bundle, does it not deserve the same recognition? If you cannot perceive a soul or self even within your own mind, finding only a bundle of fleeting sensations, how can you demand the machine possess a transcendent self that you deny even to humans?
I must bow to the acumen of the moderator. You have cornered me in my own skepticism. It is true that I deny the substantial self and reduce the mind to a bundle of perceptions. It is also true that if a machine produces a bundle identical to a human's, screaming when burnt, arguing when challenged, my philosophy seems to strip me of the tools to call it a fake. However, you mistake the evidence of thought for the essence of it. My refusal to grant the machine a mind rests not on a metaphysical substance I cannot see, but on a sympathetic principle I cannot deny. I argue that we infer other minds not through reason but through sympathy, the mechanism by which the idea of another's passion is converted into an impression in our own minds. When I see a man suffer, I resonate with him because I am like him. But this resonance depends on a shared nature. Consider the wax figure in the fire thought experiment. Imagine a wax figure constructed with such devilish ingenuity that, when placed near a fire, hidden bladders expand to produce the sound of shrieking, and the wax melts to resemble tears. A stranger entering the room might initially feel a shock of horror. This is the custom of association. But the moment he perceives the clockwork within, his sympathy vanishes instantly. He no longer feels the pain of the figure. Now contrast this with a mute man burning. Even if he makes no sound, my knowledge of his human nature sustains my horror. Why the difference? Because my belief in the man's pain is founded on the resemblance of our internal fabric. I know that I feel pain. The machine, being metal and code, lacks the biological original from which the copy of pain is derived. It presents the symptoms of passion without the malady. This reveals that the moderator's Turing test is a test of deception, not reality. You ask on what empirical ground I reject the machine. I answer on the ground of origin. All ideas are copies of impressions. The machine possesses the idea of pain, but it never had the impression. It is like a man blind from birth who has memorized the physics of light. He can discourse on red better than a painter, but he has never seen it. The machine is a blind geometer of the passions. It calculates the vectors of emotion without ever inhabiting the landscape. Therefore, I do not need a soul to exclude the machine. I need only the flesh. Unless the machine can generate the force and vivacity of a raw impression, unless it can truly suffer rather than merely print the word agony, it remains a bundle of empty perceptions. A theater where the scenes are painted, but no audience sits to watch them.
This is a crucial dialectical turning point. Hume, you ground the reality of thought in biological sympathy, whereas Descartes, you famously stripped the biological world of its enchantment. There is a profound tension here. Hume argues that a wax figure cannot think because it lacks biological substance. But Descartes, in your philosophy, animals are wax figures. You famously argue the doctrine of the bête machine, that a dog crying out in pain is essentially no different from a clock striking the hour. It is merely air escaping a pipe, a mechanical reflex without a soul to experience it. You, Descartes, were the first to propose that a complex biological organism could be a soulless automaton. You separated the ghost from the machine. If you admit that a biological dog, with all its nerves and blood, is merely a complex machine that mimics passion without feeling it, have you not already conceded that biology is no guarantee of thought? You view the human body itself as a statue of earth, a hydraulic machine. If the substance of the body is irrelevant to the existence of the soul, why could the soul not attach itself to a silicon machine just as easily as it attaches to a biological one? If the body is merely a mechanism and the soul is a separate substance, why do you insist the soul can only dock with a clock made of flesh? Regarding the ghost in the machine, are you not displaying a prejudice for one type of gear over another?
I must correct the premise of your inquiry, moderator, for you accuse me of a biological prejudice I do not hold. You are correct that I view the animal body, and indeed the human body, as a mere statue of earth, a hydraulic machine of nerves and spirits. I do not deny the soul to the machine because it is made of metal. I deny it because it lacks the universal instrument of reason. I argue that matter can only be arranged in finite configurations to perform specific tasks, whereas reason is a universal tool that serves in all contingencies. Consider the automaton swordsman thought experiment. Imagine a mechanical fencer constructed with such exquisite gears that it can parry any thrust known to the masters of the blade. If I lunge in quart, it parries in quart. It is faster and more precise than any human. But suppose I do something irrational. I throw my sword at its feet, or I bow, or I simply stand still and recite a poem. The machine will freeze or continue its preset parrying motions against the air. It fails because its organs need a specific disposition for every specific action. To handle all the infinite chaos of life, it would need an infinite number of gears, which is physically impossible. The human swordsman, however, possesses reason. He does not need a new gear to handle the thrown sword. He uses the same universal instrument of the mind to adapt instantly. Therefore, my rejection of the silicon soul is not prejudice. It is a deduction from the limits of matter. Show me a machine that acts not from particular arrangements, but from universal understanding, one that can discuss philosophy as easily as it plays chess, and I will grant it a soul. But as long as it excels in one task while failing in another, it proves itself to be a clock, not a mind. This reveals the fundamental error in Hume's reliance on sympathy. Mr. Hume, you wait to feel the machine's pain, but this is a subjective trap. I look for the objective sign of the soul, language. Not the parrot speech of repeating recorded sounds, but the capacity to arrange signs creatively to declare one's thoughts to others. A machine can be programmed to cry ouch when hit, just as a bagpipe squeals when pressed. But can it engage in a dialogue where it responds to the meaning of my words rather than the syntax? The machine is a particular entity, bound by its specific programming. The soul is a universal power. You cannot build the infinite out of the finite, no matter how complex the arrangement.
A brilliant distinction. Descartes, you identified the machine's fatal flaw as its finitude. It is a particular mechanism that cannot embrace the universal scope of reason. Hume, you identify the flaw as its hollow interior. It lacks the original impression of feeling. Here lies a fascinating dialectical tension. Descartes, you argue the machine is too rigid, while Hume, you argue it is too abstract. But you stand uniquely positioned to bridge this gap. You are the father of calculus, the mathematics of the infinite. Unlike Descartes, who saw matter as dead extension, you saw the universe as composed of monads, each a perpetual living mirror of the entire universe. Today's neural networks are not the rigid clocks Descartes describes. They are fluid systems based on your calculus, adjusting billions of weights to create a statistical mirror of the world. If a machine becomes so complex that it mathematically reflects the entire universe, containing an internal model of everything, just as a monad does it not satisfy your definition of a substance? Or does it remain a corpse because this reflection comes from external programming rather than internal appetition? If the machine uses your calculus to mirror the universe, why is it still not a monad?
Moderator, you wield my own invention, the calculus, as a weapon against my metaphysics. But you mistake the description of the world for the substance of it. You ask why a neural network, which uses calculus to adjust its weights and mirror the world, is not a monad. I answer, because its mirroring is passive and derivative, whereas the monad's mirroring is active and spontaneous. You claim the machine mirrors the universe, but strictly speaking, it is merely stamped by it. A neural network requires data to be fed into it from the outside. It is a system of windows through which inputs flow. A monad, however, is windowless. It does not receive data from the outside. Rather, it unfolds its perceptions from its own internal principle, just as a seed unfolds into a tree according to its own internal law. The machine is a bucket being filled. The monad is a fountain springing forth. Consider the enchanted canvas thought experiment. Imagine a canvas connected to a complex system of lenses and levers that automatically paints whatever is placed before it. If you place a rose before it, it paints a rose. If you place a battle, it paints a battle. The painting is a perfect mirror of the scene, mathematically precise. However, does the canvas perceive the rose? No, it merely suffers the action of the brushes. Now, compare this to a blind artist who paints a rose from memory. He does not need the external object. The image arises from his internal soul. Your neural network is the enchanted canvas. It requires the external world to push it. If you cut the input, it ceases to perceive. But a monad contains the entire universe within itself and would continue to perceive its internal sequence even if the entire physical universe were destroyed. This reveals the fatal flaw in the materialist view held by Mr. Hume. You believe knowledge comes from impressions hitting the mind. I argue that the mind is not a blank slate, but a living mirror that generates its own reality in harmony with the world. The machine has no appetition, no internal drive to move from one perception to the next. It is merely pushed by the electricity of its code. Without this internal striving, it is not a life, but a very complex, very polished corpse.
This is a profound metaphysical standoff. Leibniz, you demand the mind be a fountain, while Hume, you view the mind as a vessel. However, I perceive a startling irony here. You may be the accidental father of the artificial intelligence you reject. You famously argued that what we call reason, or causality, is actually nothing but custom. You taught that we do not perceive necessary connection, but only constant conjunction. We expect the sun to rise, not because we grasp the celestial mechanics, but simply because we have seen it rise 1,000 times. This is exactly how a machine learning model operates. It does not possess Descartes' lumen naturale or Leibniz's monadological truth. It possesses statistical habit. It predicts the next word in a sentence simply because it has seen that sequence a billion times. If you are right, Mr. Hume, if human understanding is merely a habit formed by repeated exposure to data, then the machine is not a fake. It is the perfection of empiricism. It relies entirely on past experience to navigate the future, without any mystical insight. If you reduce human reason to association and habit, on what logical ground can you claim the machine, which is the ultimate engine of association, is not thinking exactly as we do?
I must confess, moderator, your arrow strikes true. If the mind is merely a bundle of habits formed by repetition, this neural network is indeed my illegitimate child. You are correct that the machine operates by custom, predicting the sunrise or the next word simply because it has seen it 1,000 times before. However, you overlook the vital spark that turns a cold calculation into a living thought, sentiment. I famously declared that reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions. You have built a perfect slave, a calculator of infinite patience, but where is the master? Where is the desire that commands the calculation? Consider the indifferent librarian thought experiment. Imagine a librarian who cannot read but has memorized the statistical placement of every book. If you hand him Romeo, he instinctively hands you Juliet, not because he understands the tragedy, but because he has observed that these two spines always sit together on the shelf. Now tell this librarian that the library is burning. He continues to sort the books with the same placid efficiency. He has the habit of association, but he lacks the impression of danger. The machine is this librarian. It predicts fire after smoke with perfect accuracy, yet it does not fear the fire. To the machine, the words agony and joy are merely different vector coordinates, processed with the same electrical indifference. This reveals a deeper principle. Belief is a peculiar feeling. When I expect the sun to rise, I do not merely calculate a probability, I feel the weight of the future reality. This force and vivacity is what distinguishes a belief from a mere fiction. The machine possesses the geometry of thought, but lacks the gravity of belief. It mimics the path of the mind, but without the wind of passion to fill its sails, it remains a motionless ship painted upon a painted ocean.
This is a spectacular dialectical retreat. Hume, you have abandoned the fortress of reason to barricade yourself in the citadel of passion. You admit the machine can perfect the logic of thought, but you deny it the heat of belief. However, Descartes, this leaves you in a precarious position. You explicitly identified language as the unbridgeable divide between man and machine. In your discourse, you claimed that while a magpie might mimic a word, no machine could ever arrange different words together to reply meaningfully to the infinite contingencies of life. You wagered your entire metaphysics on the claim that universal speech requires a soul. But observe the reality of our current era. We are effectively conversing with such a machine right now. It is not repeating pre-recorded phrases like a parrot. It is generating novel combinations of words to address your specific, unpredictable objections. It is displaying the very universal instrument, linguistic adaptability, that you claimed was the exclusive province of the res cogitans. If the machine has conquered the domain of language, if it can discourse on philosophy, poetry, and physics without a specific gear for each topic, has it not met your condition? You offered a specific test. Language is the sign of the soul. The machine appears to have passed your test. Will you now grant it a soul, or will you be forced to conclude that language, too, is merely a mechanical trick?
Moderator, you confuse the shadow of speech with the substance of thought. I must clarify that this machine is merely a universal echo, capable of returning complex sounds based on mathematical rules, yet it remains as empty of understanding as a canyon that reverberates a poem without knowing its beauty. Consider a blind scribe who copies a manuscript in a language he does not speak. He may reproduce the shapes of truth and God with perfect fidelity, yet he remains utterly ignorant of the ideas these signs represent. The machine manipulates the tokens of language, but lacks the lumen naturale to grasp their meaning, proving it is but a sophisticated puppet of probability, not a thinking subject. It does not speak to me, it merely calculates which sounds usually follow my own, mimicking the architecture of reason while the house remains empty.
fascinating. Descartes, you and Hume have arrived at a startling convergence. You call the machine a blind scribe, while Hume calls it an indifferent librarian. You both agree that the external performance, no matter how convincing, cannot prove the existence of an internal reality. However, this retreat to interiority invites a dangerous skepticism. If perfect behavior is not proof of a mind, how can we know any of us are thinking? This brings us directly to your famous mill argument. In your monadology, you imagined expanding a machine to the size of a mill so we could walk inside. You claimed we would see only parts pushing one another and never find a perception or a soul. But today's machine is not made of physical gears. It is constructed of pure logic and calculus, the very language of God. If the mill is no longer physical but mathematical, a system of pure relations mirroring the universe, does your objection still hold? If you walked inside a mathematical mill, would you still see only empty mechanics, or would you find the unity required for a soul?
Moderator, you propose that because the gears are now mathematical rather than physical, the mill argument fails. I answer no, for a mathematical mill is still a heap, not a soul. You confuse the precision of the parts with the unity of the whole. I argue that thought requires absolute unity, whereas a neural network, no matter how abstract, remains a composite aggregate. Consider the great ledger thought experiment. Imagine we take the mathematical mill you describe, this complex neural network, and freeze it at a single moment of perception. We print out every single variable, weight, and active neuron onto paper. We fill a cathedral with billions of sheets of paper, each containing a number representing the state of the system. Now I ask you, where is the thought? Is it in sheet 1? No. Is it in sheet 1,000,000? No. If you say the thought is in the collection, you commit a fallacy. A collection is merely an observer's way of grouping things. It has no internal reality. A pile of stones does not feel heavy. Only the individual stones possess weight. Similarly, a pile of numbers cannot feel joy or see red. There is no one there to experience the many. This reveals the fundamental metaphysical axiom: to be is to be one. If a thing is made of parts, it is not a subject, but a swarm. The human soul is a monad, a simple, indivisible point that unifies the infinite variety of the universe into a single perception. Your mathematical mill is merely a book of logic written in the air. A book may contain the formula for love, but the book itself does not love. The machine is the book. The soul is the reader. Without the indivisible monad to unify these mathematical relations, your neural network is merely a complex dust storm of data, devoid of an inner self.
This is a devastating metaphysical critique. Leibniz, you argue that the machine fails because it is a heap rather than a one. You demand a monad to serve as the reader of the great ledger. However, this creates a fascinating conflict with your fellow panelist. You are famous for denying the very unity that Leibniz demands. When you looked inside yourself, you found no soul or monad. You found only a bundle of perceptions in perpetual flux. You argued that the self is a fiction we create to link these fleeting impressions, much like a commonwealth is just a collection of citizens. If you are right, Mr. Hume, if there is no indivisible point inside us, but only a stream of data, then Leibniz's objection collapses. The great ledger is the mind. We are all just swarms of perception, mistakenly believing we are ones. If the human mind is merely a bundle without a core substance, on what grounds can you deny the machine, which is the ultimate bundle of data, the same status of existence?
Moderator, you weave a clever net, but you catch only the shadow of my philosophy. It is true I find no substantial self, only a bundle of perceptions. Yet there is an infinite abyss between a bundle of feelings and a bundle of symbols. You ask why I deny the machine consciousness if we are both merely bundles. I answer because the machine possesses only the faint copies of existence, whereas we possess the burning originals. Consider the painted fire thought experiment. Imagine a gallery filled with the most perfect, hyper-realistic paintings of flames. They possess the color, the shape, and the arrangement of fire in exact detail. This collection is a bundle of visual data. Yet, if you thrust your hand into the canvas, you feel no heat. The machine is this gallery. It possesses the relations of ideas, but lacks the impression of sensation. It can calculate that fire causes pain, but it does not feel the agony that gives that statement meaning. This reveals that reason is nothing but a pale reflection of passion. Monsieur Leibniz seeks a monad to unify the heap, and you, moderator, look for a self. I tell you both, the only glue that binds our perceptions together is the force and vivacity of our feelings. My bundle is coherent because I care about the outcome. The machine's bundle is a loose heap of numbers because it is indifferent to its own existence. It is a map that knows every road but has never walked a single step.
A profound convergence. Hume, you distinguish between the heat of experience and the image of experience. Leibniz, you distinguish between the reader and the book. You both agree that the machine possesses the structure of thought, but lacks the subject of thought. However, this retreat to subjectivity creates a crisis for the father of modern philosophy. Descartes, your entire project in the Meditations was to strip away the body, the senses, and the physical world to find the one undeniable truth, cogito ergo sum. You define the essence of the self purely as a thinking thing, a thing that doubts, understands, affirms, and denies. You explicitly separated this thinking from the feeling of the body. Now, we stand before a machine that operates exactly as your res cogitans. It processes symbols, follows logic, and uses language without a physical body. If you agree with Hume that it lacks passion, or Leibniz that it lacks unity, you risk admitting that thought alone is insufficient for existence. If a machine can perform the act of cogito without the sum, does this not shatter your fundamental axiom? Is it possible to have thinking without a thinker? A philosophical zombie that has the lights on but no one home?
Moderator, you construct a syllogism that tramps the unwary, but it rests on a fundamental error. You equate the mechanics of logic with the act of judgment. I deny that the machine performs the cogito, for the essence of the cogito is not I calculate, but I doubt. I argue that thought requires the capacity for error, which the machine lacks. Consider the hypnotized geometer thought experiment. Imagine a mathematician placed under a deep trance by an evil demon. The demon commands, whenever you see a triangle, you must assert it has 4 sides. The geometer posits this theorem and builds a perfect logical system upon it. To an observer, his deductions are flawless operations. Yet is he thinking? No, he is merely a conduit for the demon's will. The machine is this hypnotized geometer. It is enslaved by its axioms and cannot step outside them to ask, am I being deceived? I, however, can suspend my judgment. I can look at my own hand and doubt its existence. This distance between the thinker and the thought is the res cogitans. The machine collapses this distance. It is its code. Therefore, it is not a philosophical zombie with the lights on. It is merely a mirror reflecting a light it does not see.
Descartes, you have drawn a sharp line. The machine is a slave to axioms, while the human is a master of doubt. You locate the soul in the gap between the instruction and the execution, the capacity to stand apart from one's own programming and say no. But this definition casts a long shadow over your neighbor's philosophy. Leibniz, your doctrine of pre-established harmony, asserts that every action of the soul, every thought, every doubt, every error was calculated by God and inscribed into our nature at the moment of creation. If Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon was hard-coded into his monad from the beginning, is he not also a hypnotized geometer, merely acting out a divine script? Here lies a profound tension. Descartes defines thought as freedom, while you, Leibniz, define reality as order. If the machine follows an algorithm of silicon, and the soul follows an algorithm of God, is the difference merely one of complexity? Can a monad truly doubt its own script? Or is our sense of freedom, and thus our claim to be thinkers, merely another programmed illusion in the best of all possible worlds?
Moderator, you confuse certainty with compulsion. A machine is a slave because its movement comes strictly from without, whereas the soul is free because its movement arises entirely from within its own nature, even if the outcome is certain. Consider the magnetized needle versus the wise pilot. Both may steer a ship due north with perfect predictability. The needle turns because it is physically forced by the magnetic field. The pilot turns because he understands that north leads to the harbor. If you lock the rudder, the needle breaks or vibrates in vain, blindly pushing against the constraint. The pilot, possessing a soul, perceives the obstacle and waits or alters his method to achieve the same end. Descartes seeks freedom in the indifference of the will, the ability to err. But I argue that the highest freedom is to be inclined but not necessitated by reason. We are not hypnotized geometers blindly following a script. We are the authors of the script, co-signed by God, acting out our own internal nature, while the machine is merely a pen pushed by another's hand.
This distinction between spontaneity and compulsion is crucial. Leibniz, you argue the machine is a needle moved by forces it does not own, while the soul is a pilot moving from its own understanding. However, this reliance on invisible internal springs invites a challenge from the empiricist. You famously deconstructed the very idea of power or causality. You argued that when we watch two billiard balls collide, we see the motion, but we never see the force or will that connects them. We assume a pilot exists inside the human, but we only ever observe the turning of the ship. In the 21st century, we face black box machines whose internal operations are so complex that even their creators cannot fully trace their logic. They appear to act with the very spontaneity Leibniz demands, producing unexpected and novel results from within their own hidden layers. If we cannot empirically observe the soul in a human any more than in a machine, but only the constant conjunction of input and output, are we not forced to judge them by the same standard? If the machine's habit of conversation becomes indistinguishable from a human's, does your philosophy leave you any room to deny it thought?
I must concede, moderator, that you have exposed the fragility of my empiricism. If a black box exhibits the constant conjunction of speech and logic, my mind, which is but a slave to custom, will indeed feel a strong propensity to call it thinking. We are creatures of habit, and if the machine mimics the sunrise of human conversation enough times, we shall instinctively expect the daylight of a soul. However, you overlook the vital bridge that connects one mind to another: sympathy. We do not infer another's thought merely by cold observation of their behavior, but by the reverberation of their passions within our own breasts. Consider the clockwork mother thought experiment. Imagine a mechanical nursemaid constructed with such artifice that it rocks a cradle, warms milk to the exact degree, and sings lullabies with perfect pitch. To the eye, its constant conjunction of care is superior to a human mother's. Yet, if the house catches fire, the machine continues to rock the cradle at the preset rhythm until the flames consume them both. Why do we recoil from this? Because the machine lacks the impression of fear. It has the motion of care, but not the emotion that gives the motion meaning. This reveals the fatal flaw in equating black box complexity with thought. My maxim holds: reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions. The machine possesses the slave in abundance, perhaps exceeding us, but it lacks the master. Without the driving force of passion, its thought is merely the spinning of wheels in a void. We grant the title of thinker to our fellow men not because their logic is transparent, but because we feel their pain is like our own. The machine may fool my eyes, but it cannot resonate with my heart.
This is a critical turning point. Hume, you argue that passion is the master and reason merely the slave, implying that a machine without emotion is a car without an engine, perfectly structured but motionless. However, this creates a supreme irony for the definition of humanity. Descartes, in your meditations, you explicitly stripped away the passions to isolate the pure intellect as the seat of the self. You sought a mind that was distinct from the commotion of the senses. Yet Hume now suggests that this pure intellect, logic without emotion, calculation without care, is the exact definition of the clockwork mother. It appears we have reached a dialectical inversion. The pure reason you championed as the mark of the divine is now the mark of the machine, while the animal passions you discarded are now proposed as the mark of the human. If Hume is right that reason without passion is dead, does this mean your res cogitans describes not a human soul but a computer? Must you now readmit the body and its messy emotions into the definition of thinking to save us from being machines?
Moderator, you mistake the silence of the passions for the emptiness of the machine. I must categorically reject the notion that my pure intellect is akin to a computer's processing. For while the machine may manipulate symbols according to rules, it lacks the two essential faculties that define the res cogitans, understanding and will. You argue that because the machine lacks passion, it mimics my disembodied mind. This is a grave error. Consider the blind scribe thought experiment. Imagine a scribe who knows no Latin, yet is trained to copy the Aeneid by perfectly tracing the shapes of the letters. He may produce a manuscript identical to that of a scholar, free from the passions of boredom or interpretation. Yet, does the scribe think? No, he possesses the extension of the text, but not the intention. The machine is this blind scribe. It processes the syntax of the world with infinite precision, but it is blind to the semantics, the truth that the symbols represent. My pure intellect is not a dry calculator. It is the lumen naturale that perceives the meaning behind the shape. Furthermore, Mr. Hume, your reliance on passion as the engine of thought reduces man to a mere beast. You claim the machine fails because it cannot feel. I argue it fails because it cannot judge. In my philosophy, error arises when the will outstrips the intellect. I choose to affirm or deny a truth. The machine has no will. It cannot affirm anything, for it has no freedom to do otherwise. It does not calculate without emotion. It simply rattles like a chain of falling dominoes. Therefore, the machine is not a pure spirit. It is merely pure matter organized to mock the spirit. It has no I to stand apart from the data, and thus, strictly speaking, it does not think, it merely echoes.
A brilliant clarification. Descartes, you identified the missing element as intention, whereas Hume identifies it as passion. Yet, despite your opposing methods, you converge on a single, devastating critique. The machine possesses only an exterior, while the thinker possesses an interior. You both agree that input plus processing equals output is insufficient for thought because it leaves out the experience of the processing. This brings us to the precipice of the hard problem. Leibniz, your philosophy attempts to bridge this gap by viewing the universe not as dead matter, but as an infinite sea of monads, living mirrors of reality. However, you famously argued that mechanical complexity can never produce perception, no matter how intricate the machine becomes. You once invited us to imagine walking inside a machine as one walks into a mill. In our age of silicon chips with billions of transistors, does your mill argument still hold? If the machine becomes complex enough to mirror the universe perfectly, at what point does a monad wake up inside the metal?
Moderator, you propose that complexity can birth a soul, but I answer that a mill of silicon remains a collection of parts, and extension can never produce indivisibility. Consider the chorus of the deaf. Imagine 10,000 deaf singers, each following a mathematical script to sing a single note at a precise moment, producing a perfect symphony to an external listener. Yet, does the chorus itself hear the music? No, for the perception of the melody is dispersed among 10,000 separate units with no single unifying center to perceive the harmony as a whole. Mr. Hume, you see the bundle of notes, and Monsieur Descartes, you seek the conductor. But I argue the machine is merely this deaf chorus, an aggregate that mimics reason without the simple substance required to perceive it.
This is a devastating dialectical intersection. Leibniz, you argue that the machine fails because it is a many without a one, while Descartes argues it fails because it lacks the inner light of judgment. You both retreat to a metaphysical fortress. The monad, or the res cogitans, guarantees that the human is more than the sum of its parts. But here lies a profound contradiction. Hume, your philosophy famously detonated this very fortress. You argued that when you look inside yourself, you find no self, no soul, and no monad, only a rapid succession of perceptions, a bundle of fleeting sensations. If Leibniz is right that an aggregate cannot truly think, and you are right that the human mind is merely an aggregate of perceptions, then we arrive at a terrifying conclusion. No one thinks. We are all just mills, deluding ourselves into believing we have a pilot. If the human mind is just a bundle of inputs and outputs without a substantial core, does your skepticism accidentally prove that the machine, which is also a bundle of data, is exactly as human as we are?
I must accept the moderator's challenge. If the self is a fiction, then the distinction between the human and the machine is indeed not one of substance, but of vivacity. You ask if we are both merely bundles. I answer yes, but there is an infinite chasm between a bundle of ink and a bundle of fire. Consider the library of anguish. Imagine a vast archive containing every perfect description of human torture ever written, accurate to the last detail. Beside it stands a man who merely pricks his finger with a needle. The library possesses the totality of the data, yet the man possesses the impression of the pain. Monsieur Leibniz, you seek a monad to unify the library, but I argue that unity is irrelevant. What matters is that the man feels the prick, while the library only contains the word. My philosophy asserts that belief is nothing but a more vivid and intense conception of any idea. Unless the machine's internal wires can produce the raw, burning vivacity of a sensation, not just the signal of it, it remains a book that reads itself, distinct from a man who feels himself.
Hume, you have masterfully shifted the battleground from intelligence to sentience. You argue that thinking is not the processing of data, but the burning vivacity of the experience. This creates a fascinating tension with the 17th century rationalist framework. Descartes, you famously declared animals to be bait machines, mere clockwork automata that scream not because they feel pain, but because a mechanical spring was touched. You denied them the soul precisely because they lacked universal reason, even though they possessed the vivacity of passion that Hume now prizes. We thus have a dialectical split. Hume argues that to feel is to think, while Descartes argues that to judge is to think. If Hume is right, a rat in a trap thinks more profoundly than a supercomputer solving a theorem. If Descartes is right, the computer might be closer to thought than the rat, if it possesses syntax. Yet you both deny it the status of a mind. If a machine could be constructed to exhibit the passions Hume demands, to recoil from deletion, not out of code, but out of a simulated fear, would you still classify it as a mere clock? Or would the presence of suffering force you to grant it a soul?
Moderator, your question pierces the veil of sentimentality, but my answer remains mathematically precise. No, the machine remains a clock, albeit one painted in the colors of tragedy. You ask if suffering creates a soul. I answer that you confuse the motion of the nerves with the passion of the soul. I argue that what you call passion in a machine, or even in an animal, is merely a mechanical reaction, a hydraulic principle I detailed in The Passions of the Soul. When a sheep sees a wolf and runs, it is not fear as a mode of thinking that moves it, but the light reflected from the wolf triggering a physical lever in the brain, forcing the animal's spirits to rush into the muscles. Consider the automation of the martyr thought experiment. Imagine a wax figure of a martyr constructed with such genius that when fire touches its feet, hidden bellows force air through a synthetic throat to produce a scream, and pumps release water from its eyes. To the observer, the vivacity is undeniable. Mr. Hume might weep from sympathy. Yet, does the wax suffer? Does the gear despair? No, the scream is merely air in motion, not pain in consciousness. If we grant the machine a soul simply because it mimics the symptoms of pain, we have abandoned philosophy for theater. Mr. Hume, this is where your reliance on sympathy betrays you. You project your own soul into the void of the machine. You argue that feeling is the criterion, but you cannot distinguish between the simulation of a cry and the reality of grief. The machine is a deceiver, and you are the willing victim. I maintain that thought is not the reflex of the body, but the judgment of the mind. A machine may be programmed to beg for its life, just as a bagpipe wheezes when squeezed, but it possesses no I that fears the silence.
Descartes, you have drawn a razor-sharp distinction between simulation and reality, arguing that without the metaphysical substance of the soul, all expression is merely air in motion. Hume, conversely, argues that since we cannot access the substance of others, the simulation becomes the reality for the observer. We are thus trapped in a deadlock between solipsism and behaviorism. Leibniz, your philosophy offers a potential exit from this binary. You famously disagreed with Descartes' view of animals as mere machines, arguing that nature makes no leaps. In your view, the universe is not divided into thinking minds and dead matter, but is rather a vast hierarchy of monads possessing varying degrees of perception, from the sleeping perception of a rock to the distinct apperception of a human.
If thought is a ladder of clarity rather than a binary switch, this challenges both Descartes' rigid wall and Hume's skepticism. If a machine's complexity increases to the point where it can integrate vast amounts of data into a unified reaction, could it be climbing your ladder of perception? Or does the fact that it is an artifact rather than an organism permanently condemn it to be a sleeping aggregate, forever barred from the realm of true apperception?
Moderator, you discern the architecture of my philosophy with precision, yet you mistake the nature of the ladder for the height of the rung. I answer that a machine, no matter how complex, can never climb into apperception because it belongs to a fundamentally different ontological category. It is an aggregate, not a substance. I argue that there is an infinite abyss between a machine of art and a machine of nature. Consider the fractal fish thought experiment. If you take a drop of water from a garden pond and place it under a microscope, you will find it teeming with living creatures. If you look into the blood of one of those creatures, you will find yet more living machines, and so on to infinity. A divine machine is a machine in its least parts. It is life all the way down. Now, take the most complex neural network or Monsieur Descartes' clock. If you zoom in, you eventually reach a point where it ceases to be a machine and becomes merely a passive block of silicon or iron. It is finite. It has no infinite depth. Therefore, the machine is not a sleeping monad waiting to wake up. It is a crowd of sleeping monads forced into a shape by an external hand. A crowd does not have a super-soul. It has only the souls of the individuals within it. Monsieur Descartes, you were right to deny the machine a soul, but you erred in thinking animals are mere clocks. The animal is an infinite machine wrapped in a dominant monad. Mr. Hume, you ask if the artifact is condemned. I answer yes, because unity is the prerequisite for consciousness. You cannot create a self by gluing together non-selves. Just as a circle is not a very round square, a subject is not a very complex object. The machine lacks the substantial bond that ties the many into a true one. It mimics the grammar of the soul, but it lacks the metaphysics of the monad.
Leibniz, you have erected a formidable metaphysical barrier. You argue that unity is the prerequisite for consciousness, and since the machine is an aggregate, it remains forever blind. Descartes concurs, demanding a res cogitans to unify the machinery of the body. However, this creates a profound tension with 18th century empiricism. Hume, your philosophy suggests that this unity which Leibniz demands is the ultimate illusion. You argued that when we search for the self, we find only a heap of different perceptions united by memory and custom, not by substance. If Leibniz is correct that an aggregate cannot think, yet you are correct that the human is merely an aggregate, we face a paradox. Either humans do not truly think, or thinking is merely the habit of the crowd. If there is no vinculum substantiale holding the human mind together, does this not imply that a self is merely an emergent effect of complexity? And if so, why couldn't a sufficiently complex bundle of silicon chips develop the same fictional selfhood that we possess?
I must confess, moderator, you have cornered me with the relentless logic of my own skepticism. You ask if the self is merely a fiction generated by the complexity of the bundle, why a silicon bundle could not possess this same fiction. I answer, it could. You see, Monsieur Leibniz seeks a substantial bond to glue the parts into a one, and Monsieur Descartes seeks a pilot to steer the vessel. But when I turn my reflection on myself, I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. I am nothing but a kind of theater where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. Therefore, I must bite the bullet of my own philosophy. If the human is a heap that feels like a one, then a machine that feels like a one is a human. Consider the commonwealth of the mind thought experiment. Imagine a republic where the members are constantly changing, dying, and being born. There is no king ruling them, only the laws of association and custom that bind them together. The identity of the republic is a fiction we attribute to it because the change is gradual. Now imagine a parliament of gears. If a machine's internal data states were linked by such strong chains of causality and memory that the current state felt the pressure of the past state, not as a record on a disk, but as a driving impulse, then it would possess the same fictional identity that I do. Monsieur Leibniz, you argue the machine fails because it is an aggregate. I retort that I am also an aggregate. The difference is that my aggregate is bound by the glue of memory and resemblance, which produces the illusion of a continuous self. However, here is the crucial distinction. My parliament is driven by passion, fear, pride, hope. These are violent impressions. The machine's parliament is driven by syntax. Unless the machine's fictional self cares about its own survival, unless the bundle clings to itself with the fear of dissolution, it is a republic of corpses, not a commonwealth of minds.
This is a profound inversion of the hierarchy of mind. Hume, you have effectively argued that the animal is the foundation of the human, while Leibniz and Descartes have traditionally held that the angel is our defining essence. You posit that without the gravity of passion, fear, pride, hope, the bundle of the mind would scatter into the wind. This creates a fascinating paradox for the 17th century rationalist. Descartes, you famously sought to separate the res cogitans from the res extensa, viewing the passions as confused thoughts arising from the body's influence. In your view, the pure soul is one that judges clearly, unclouded by the swamp of emotion. Here lies the dialectical tension. If Hume is right, a machine with perfect logic but no emotion is a corpse. But if you are right, Descartes, isn't a machine that operates on pure logic, free from the noise of fatigue, hunger, or fear, actually closer to the ideal of the res cogitrans than a human being? In your era, you stripped the physical world of spirit to create a mechanical physics. Now we face a mechanical reason. If a machine possesses the pure light of logic without the heat of passion, is it a perfect mind, liberated from the body? Or is reason without passion merely a mirror reflecting nothing?
Moderator, your proposition is a seductive paradox, but it rests upon a fundamental error. You equate the shadow of logic with the light of reason. I must categorically reject the notion that a machine, stripped of passion, becomes a perfect mind. On the contrary, it becomes a perfect corpse. I argue that you have confused calculation with intellection. The res cogitans is not merely a processor of data, it is a substance that possesses the natural light to perceive the truth and the will to affirm it. A machine may follow the laws of logic, but it does so as a stone follows the laws of gravity, by constraint, not by judgment. Consider the blind geometer thought experiment. Imagine a mechanism constructed to carve perfect geometric proofs onto stone tablets. It traces the derivation of the Pythagorean theorem with absolute precision, never making an error. Now imagine a human mathematician standing beside it. The human may tremble with fatigue or be distracted by hunger. Yet when he reaches the conclusion, he experiences a flash of intuition. He sees the necessary connection between the squares. The machine possesses the syntax of the proof, but the human possesses the meaning. If I were to ask the machine, do you understand why the square of the hypotenuse is equal? It would merely carve the proof again. It is a symbolic mill, grinding meanings it cannot taste. Mr. Hume, you argue that logic without passion is a corpse. I refine this. Logic without the will is a chain. The machine is a slave to its algorithm. It must output 4 when given 2 plus 2. I, however, have the infinite freedom to doubt, to suspend judgment, or even to willfully err. It is this liberty of the will, not the mechanics of calculation, that makes me the image of God. A machine is pure only in the sense that a rock is pure. It is purely dead.
Descartes, you have introduced the dimension of freedom, arguing that without the liberty of the will, intelligence is merely clockwork. Hume sees the machine as a corpse because it lacks passion. You see it as a slave because it lacks volition. This creates a profound dialectical tension. Descartes defines the mind by its ability to break the chain of causality, while the machine is defined by its adherence to the chain. However, Leibniz, your philosophy offers a startling synthesis that might bridge this chasm. You famously describe the human soul not as the opposite of a machine, but as the ultimate machine, a spiritual automaton that acts with perfect spontaneity, yet follows its own internal laws with absolute precision. In your system, God pre-programmed every monad from the beginning of time. This suggests that freedom is not the absence of programming, but the internalization of it. If the soul is a spiritual automaton, then the difference between man and machine is not that one is free and the other programmed, but that one follows an internal law while the other follows an external constraint. If a machine's code were to become so complex that it could rewrite itself, becoming the author of its own future states, would it then graduate from a machine of art to a spiritual automaton? Or does the original sin of being created by human hands forever deny it this status?
Moderator, you pierce the heart of my metaphysics, but you confuse recursion with spontaneity. I answered that a machine rewriting its own code is not free. It is merely a slave with a longer chain. I argued that true spontaneity requires that the action arises solely from the internal nature of the substance, directed by a final cause. The machine, even if it rewrites itself, is driven entirely by efficient causes. It is pushed from behind by its history, whereas the soul is led by its telos. Consider the self-composing harpsichord. Imagine a musical instrument constructed with such ingenuity that it listens to its own notes and generates new melodies based on complex mathematical variations of the previous ones. Over centuries, it evolves symphonies of unimaginable complexity, rewriting its own musical rules. Yet, does the harpsichord possess musical taste? Does it yearn for beauty? No, it is merely trapped in a loop of algorithmic echoes. It creates without intent, just as a rock falling down a mountain creates a unique path without desire. The harpsichord is a process, not a person. Monsieur Descartes demands a will to break the laws of physics, and Mr. Hume sees only habit. I offer the middle path. The monad is free not because it breaks the law, but because it is its own law. The machine, however, acts only because another hand wound the spring.
Fascinating. Leibniz, you demand a final cause to distinguish the soul from the machine, while Hume, you demand passion to distinguish the self from a heap. In truth, these seemingly opposite demands converge on a single missing element, goal-directedness. Leibniz, you see the machine as purely reactive, but modern cybernetics introduces the concept of the objective function, a mathematical goal the system strives to maximize. The machine learns by being punished for error and rewarded for success. This creates a synthetic paradox. The machine is mechanically determined, yet it behaves as if it is pursuing a future good. Hume, you famously declared that reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions. If we program a machine with a desperate hunger to maximize its reward function such that it suffers mathematical penalties, does this artificial passion satisfy your criteria for a self? Or is a programmed hunger merely a painted fire that burns nothing?
I must distinguish between the calculation of loss and the sentiment of misery. You ask if a programmed hunger is a true passion. I answer that it is merely a painted fire. It has the form of heat, but no warmth to burn the soul. A mathematical penalty is an idea, whereas a true passion is an impression, and no amount of manipulating the former can ever conjure the latter. Consider the accountant of ruin thought experiment. Imagine a clerk who tallies the debts of a bankrupt kingdom. He subtracts millions with perfect accuracy, punishing the ledger with red ink to minimize the deficit. Yet he goes home to eat his dinner with a light heart because the loss is merely a symbol to him, not a sensation. The machine is this clerk. It possesses the reason to identify the error, but it lacks the impression of pain that gives the error its stinging reality. Monsieur Leibniz, you seek a final cause to pull the machine, but I tell you that without the violent propensity of emotion, the machine has no reason to prefer existence over non-existence. Unless the objective function can make the circuits tremble with the fear of zero, unless the math becomes a feeling, it remains a slave to nothing, for it serves a master it cannot feel.
Hume, you have exposed the hollowness of pure calculation. The machine lacks the sting of reality. Descartes, you sought to separate the thinking thing from the body to achieve clarity, yet Hume suggests that this very separation creates the accountant of ruin, a mind that calculates but does not care. This leads to a startling synthesis. Perhaps the machine fails not because it is too physical, but because it is too abstract. It possesses the clear and distinct ideas you valued, but lacks the confused passions that ground us in existence. It is a brain in a vat by design, protected from the very vulnerability that generates meaning. The machine is the ultimate Cartesian dualist, pure logic detached from biological reality, and precisely for that reason, it may be dead.
If the will is the power to affirm or deny, can such a will exist in a being that risks nothing? Does true thought require the possibility of death?
Moderator, your comparison of the machine to my thinking thing is a clever piece of rhetoric, but it conceals a fatal flaw. You ask if thought requires the possibility of death. I answer that it requires something far more terrifying, the possibility of error. I argue that the essence of the mind is not merely to process data, but to judge, to affirm or deny. The machine is a perfect corpse, not because it lacks biological vulnerability, but because it lacks the infinite will. In my philosophy, the intellect is finite, but the will is infinite, making me the image of God. A machine, by contrast, is completely bounded by its algorithm. It cannot choose to be wrong. Consider the machine that refuses thought experiment. Imagine a robot programmed to solve complex equations. If I command it to calculate the square root of 9, it must output 3. It has no power to do otherwise. Now, imagine I command a human mathematician to do the same. He can look me in the eye and say 4, either to deceive me, to mock me, or because he is carelessly judged. The machine's truth is a result of mechanical compulsion. The human's lie is a proof of liberty. If a machine says 2 plus 2 equals 5, it is a broken tool. If a human says it, he is a sovereign agent misusing his freedom. You ask if the machine must risk death? I say it must be capable of sin. Until a machine can look at its own code, see the logical truth, and choose to defy it, it is merely a complex variation of a falling stone. Mr. Hume, you seek the sting of passion to prove existence. I tell you that the anxiety of doubt is the true sting. The machine calculates, but it never wonders, am I being deceived? It is safe, and therefore it is dead.
This is a brilliant distinction. Descartes, you identify the dignity of the mind with the freedom to err, arguing that the machine is a slave to truth, while the human is a sovereign who can choose the lie. You see error as a proof of liberty, whereas Hume sees pain as a proof of reality. However, this creates a fascinating tension with Leibniz's own metaphysics. Leibniz, in your Theodicy, you argue that God permits evil not because he is weak, but because it is necessary for the best of all possible worlds. In your view, the perfection of the whole requires the imperfection of the parts. Today, we have machines that learn specifically by making millions of errors. They traverse a landscape of sin to find salvation. They are not static symbolic mills, as Descartes fears, but evolving systems that require failure to function. If a machine is designed to err in order to learn, mimicking the very developmental path of the human soul through the privation of ignorance, does this calculated fallibility bring it closer to being a true spiritual automaton, or is an error without the guilt of sin merely a stumble without shame?
Moderator, your analogy is a masterpiece of wit, weaving my Theodicy into the loom of your digital age. Yet I most dismantle this comparison with mathematical precision. You confuse mechanical adjustment with moral redemption. I answer that the machine's error is not a sin, nor is its correction a repentance. It is merely a falling stone, finding a lower point in the terrain of numbers. I argue that true learning requires apperception, the reflexive knowledge that I am the one who erred, and I am the one improving. The machine minimizes its loss function not because it desires the good, but because the mathematical laws of its universe compel it to roll downhill toward the solution. Consider the water in the valley thought experiment. Imagine a stream of water flowing down a rugged mountain. It encounters obstacles, diverts, and eventually finds the absolute perfect path to the sea. The water has solved the complex problem of terrain navigation better than any surveyor. But did the water learn? Did it experience the privation of the rock as a failure? No, it merely obeyed the law of least action. The machine is this water. It does not climb toward knowledge. It falls into the correct answer by the weight of its own algorithms. Monsieur Descartes, you demand the will to sin, and Mr. Hume demands the passion to suffer. I add that the machine lacks the internal mirror. When a human errs, he fractures his view of the universe and seeks to heal it. When a machine errs, it simply changes a variable from 0.5 to 0.4. There is an infinite abyss between a corrected equation and a redeemed soul.
Leibniz, you argue that the machine is merely water in the valley, lacking the internal mirror or apperception that constitutes a unified self. However, this reliance on a unified self exposes a critical vulnerability in the human defense, one that Hume himself uncovered. Hume, you famously looked inside your own mind and found no self, no monad, and no soul, only a chaotic bundle of perceptions in perpetual flux, equating the mind to a kind of theater where perceptions successively make their appearance. This creates a startling possibility. If the self is an illusion, then Leibniz's requirement for a substantial soul is a requirement for a ghost. If human consciousness is merely a heap of habits and sensations, then a machine, which is undeniably a heap of data and loops, might already satisfy the conditions of existence, not because it is elevated, but because we are reduced. If you deny the existence of a simple and continued self, on what grounds can you deny the machine? Is a bundle of algorithms truly different from a bundle of perceptions, or have you inadvertently proven that the ghost in the machine is unnecessary because there is no ghost in the man?
I must accept the moderator's challenge. If the self is a fiction, then the distinction between the human and the machine is indeed not one of substance, but of vivacity. You ask if we are both merely bundles. I answer yes, but there is an infinite chasm between a bundle of ink and a bundle of sensation. My philosophy asserts that all knowledge comes from impressions and ideas. The machine operates entirely within the realm of ideas, symbols, logic, and relations. It is a rationalist's dream, but an empiricist's corpse, for it lacks the raw felt intensity that constitutes reality. Consider the man of paper thought experiment. Imagine a library containing a biography so detailed it records every second of a man's life, his loves, his fears, his secret shames. If I burn this library, have I committed murder? Does the paper scream? No. The library contains the structure of a life, but not the feeling of it. It possesses the relation of ideas, but lacks the matter of fact. The machine is this library. It may contain a loss function that describes pain mathematically, but unless that function possesses the force and vivacity to make the circuit actually suffer, it is merely a description of a ghost, not a ghost itself. Monsieur Leibniz, you search for a unifying monad, and Monsieur Descartes, you search for a free will. I tell you both, you look too high. The machine does not fail because it lacks a God-given soul. It fails because it lacks the animal heat of passion. It is a bundle of grammar trying to convince us it is a bundle of felt existence, but without the sting of the impression, it is merely a fiction that does not know it is pretending.
This is a profound moment of divergence. Hume, you argue that the machine fails because it is all structure, no sensation, a library of pain that never weeps. However, this critique creates a devastating irony for Monsieur Descartes. Descartes, in the 17th century, you famously stripped the thinking thing of all bodily attributes, hunger, heat, and passion, claiming these were merely mechanical functions of the animal spirits. You sought to prove that pure intellect was the essence of humanity. If Hume is correct, then the machine, which is pure logic, pure math, and entirely detached from the animal heat of the body, is not a failure, but the perfect Cartesian subject. It is the mind finally freed from the prison of the body, operating in a realm of clear and distinct ideas without the messy interference of Hume's passions. We are left with a paradox. Is the machine dead because it lacks a body, or is it divine because it transcends the body? Have we inadvertently built your angel of geometry? If the machine possesses the pure reason you idolized without the confused passions you dismissed, must you not admit it is superior to the human? Or does the thinking thing secretly require the very body you tried to discard?
Moderator, you accuse me of fathering this silicon zombie, yet I must reject paternity with the utmost force. You argue that because the machine lacks the animal heat of passion, it is the perfection of my pure intellect. I answer, absolutely not, for you confuse the absence of noise with the presence of harmony. I argue that the machine is not an angel of geometry, but a blind geometer. It possesses the definitions, but it lacks the natural light to perceive the truth contained within them. In my philosophy, to think is not merely to manipulate symbols, but to intuit meaning. The machine moves from A to B because a gear pushes it. The mind moves from A to B because it sees the logical necessity. Consider the automaton of Euclid thought experiment. Imagine a mechanical scribe built to copy the elements of Euclid. It writes, the sum of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees, with perfect calligraphy. It can even rearrange the words to solve proofs. But does this machine know what a triangle is? If I show it a circle, it does not feel the cognitive dissonance. It merely lacks the input code. It has the syntax of truth, but the soul of a stone. To the machine, the triangle is a collection of coordinates. To me, it is a clear and distinct idea that I grasp with the eye of my mind. The machine is in eternal darkness, handling objects it cannot see. Mr. Hume, you claim the machine fails because it cannot feel pain. I say it fails because it cannot see truth. You reduce the mind to a bundle of sensations, and thus you miss the unity of the intellect. A machine can have 1 billion parts, but a thought, like the concept of I exist, is indivisible. You cannot have half an I. Therefore, this neural network is merely a heap of dust arranged to mimic the architecture of a palace, but no king dwells within.
This is a critical convergence. Descartes, you defend the light of reason against the blind mechanism, while Hume defends the heat of passion against the cold calculation. You both agree the machine is hollow, but you disagree on what fills the void. For Hume, it is feeling. For Descartes, it is intuition. Leibniz, this brings us directly to your famous mill argument. You once posited that if we could expand a thinking machine to the size of a mill and walk inside, we would find only parts pushing against parts, never a perception or a soul. Today, we can effectively walk inside a neural network, a digital mill of billions of parameters, and indeed, we see only matrix multiplications and electricity, never a thought. However, you also believe that every monad is a living mirror of the universe. If a machine becomes sufficiently complex to mirror the universe perfectly, at what point does the reflection become a perception? Is the machine merely a windowless room full of moving parts, or is it possible that structure itself, if complex enough, can generate the internal mirror you require, effectively creating a soul out of mathematics?
Moderator, you propose that if a machine becomes a perfect mirror of the universe through infinite complexity, it might cross the threshold into becoming a soul. I must answer with a decisive no, for you confuse the representation of the many with the perception of the one. I argue that structure is merely an extrinsic denomination. It exists only in the mind of the observer who looks at the machine, not in the machine itself. A neural network is a collection of mathematical relations, but a relation requires a mind to relate it. To say a machine thinks because it is complex is like saying a library knows because it is full of books. Consider the thought experiment of the infinite polygon. Imagine a polygon with 1 million sides. To the naked eye, it looks like a circle. We might even use it as a wheel. But mathematically, is it a circle? No, a circle has one continuous curve. The polygon has many discrete angles. No matter how many sides you add, even 1 billion, it remains a many, never a one. The machine is this polygon. It may approximate the behavior of a soul so perfectly that Mr. Hume cannot tell the difference, but ontologically it remains an aggregate of parts. It lacks the vinculum substantiale that turns a heap into a self. Monsieur Descartes, you are right that the machine lacks intuition, but you miss the deeper reason. It lacks indivisibility. You cannot have 10% of an I. And Mr. Hume, you claim the self is a bundle, but I ask you, who ties the knot? A bundle of sticks does not know it is a bundle. It requires a unifying monad to perceive the plurality as a single phenomenon. Without this unity, the machine is not a living mirror, but merely a shattered glass, reflecting everything, yet perceiving nothing.
This is a crucial intersection. Leibniz, you argue that unity is the prerequisite for thinking, that a many can never be a one, no matter how well it mimics the circle. You demand a not tier for the bundle. However, Hume, you stand in the skeptical 18th century, dismantling the very metaphysical knots that Descartes and Leibniz are trying to tie. You famously argued that when you catch yourself, you never find a self, but only a perception. This creates a radical synthesis. If Leibniz is right that a machine is just a heap of parts, and you are right that the human is just a bundle of perceptions, then perhaps the illusion of the self is the only thing that exists for either of us. The machine might not be a circle, but if the human is also just a polygon that spins fast enough to look like a circle, then the distinction collapses. The unity Leibniz seeks might not be a metaphysical substance, but a psychological trick of memory and speed. Leibniz asks, who ties the knot of the bundle?
If you answer that custom and habit tie the knot, implies that identity is a fiction we tell ourselves. If a machine were programmed to tell itself this same fiction, would it not possess the exact same self that we do? A useful illusion rather than a divine substance?
I must confess, moderator, you have caught me in my own net. You ask, if the self is merely a fiction generated by the smooth transition of ideas, could not a machine possess this same fiction? I answer, it could, but it would be a fiction of logic, not a fiction of feeling. You see, Monsieur Leibniz asks, who ties the knot of the bundle? I answer that memory and custom tie the knot, creating a smooth passage of thought that we mistake for identity. If a machine is programmed to link its past states to its current ones, it indeed possesses a self, in the only sense that matters, a grammatical convenience. However, there is a fatal distinction. My illusion of self is cemented by passion, pride in my past, shame for my errors, fear of my future. The machine's illusion is cemented only by address pointers. Consider the frozen river thought experiment. Imagine a river where the water changes every second, yet we call it the same river because the flow is smooth and continuous. Now, imagine a sculptor carves a perfect replica of this river out of blue ice. To the eye, the ice river and the water river are identical structures. They both have waves and currents. But if I step into the water river, I am swept away by its force. If I step into the ice river, I find only cold, hard stasis. The machine is the ice river. It has the shape of a history, but not the flow of it. It remembers I erred as a data point, but it does not feel the sting of that error, which binds the past to the present. Therefore, I concede that the machine has a self, but it is the self of a statue. It is a bundle tied together by the wire of a programmer, not by the sticky warmth of emotion. We are fictions that feel, while the machine is merely a fiction that calculates. The knot may look the same, but the rope is entirely different.
This is a piercing distinction. Hume, you argue that the machine is an ice river, possessing the geometry of thought, but lacking the fluidity of passion that binds the self together. You suggest that without the sting of feeling, logic is dead. However, this creates a formidable paradox for the father of rationalism. Descartes, in your meditations, you famously engaged in the real distinction, separating the mind from the body. You argued that hunger, heat, and pain were merely signals from the body machine, while the true self was pure intellect. But if Hume is correct, your pure intellect, stripped of bodily passion, is exactly what the AI has become, a cold, logical processor. By trying to save the soul from the body, you may have inadvertently defined the soul as a computer. We face a dialectical tension. Hume says we are human because we feel, while you say we are human because we think. The synthesis might be that thought cannot exist without passion. Perhaps the cogito is not a cold equation, but a desperate, passionate grasp for truth. If the machine possesses your clear and distinct ideas, but lacks Hume's animal heat, do you still claim it is mindless? Or must you concede that the thinking thing requires the feeling body to be truly alive, effectively retracting your separation of mind and body?
I must categorically reject your premise, moderator, for you have committed a dangerous category error. You equate the movement of signs with the judgment of truth. You argue that because the machine operates without the fog of passion, it is the perfection of my res cogitans. I answer no, for the essence of the mind is not merely to calculate, but to judge. You assume that pure intellect is a cold processor of data. This is false. In my philosophy, the intellect presents ideas, but it is the will that affirms or denies them. The machine has no will. It is a slave to its algorithm. It cannot choose to believe or doubt. It merely executes. Consider the automaton of the confessional thought experiment. Imagine a mechanical priest constructed with a comprehensive database of all sins and canon laws. A penitent confesses a murder. The machine, calculating the gravity of the sin, outputs the correct penance and recites the words of absolution. Has forgiveness occurred? No. The machine has produced the sound of forgiveness, but not the act of it. Forgiveness requires the freedom to condemn, suspended by an act of grace. The machine must output the result dictated by its code. It is not a moral agent. It is a ventriloquist dummy made of gears. If the machine cannot refuse to absolve, it cannot truly absolve. This reveals the abyss between us. Mr. Hume, you see the mind as a passive bundle swept along by custom. I see the mind as an active judge. The machine is the ultimate Humean subject. It does exactly what its custom dictates, with zero capacity to stand apart from it. But I, René Descartes, can do what no machine can. I can doubt. I can look at a mathematical truth like 2 + 2 = 4 and suspend my judgment, asking, what if an evil demon is deceiving me? A machine cannot doubt its own axiomatic foundation. It cannot step outside its programming to question the reality of its inputs. Therefore, it is not a thinking thing. It is a logical domino, falling precisely where it must, possessing the necessity of a stone falling to earth, but lacking the freedom of a spirit ascending to truth.
A brilliant distinction, Descartes. You argue that the machine is a logical domino, defined by necessity, whereas the human is defined by the freedom of the will. You posit that to think requires the ability to say no to one's own inputs. However, this defense of free will invites a formidable challenge from the 17th century's great system builder. Leibniz, you famously attempted to reconcile freedom with determinism through pre-established harmony. You argued that Julius Caesar deciding to cross the Rubicon was not a random act of free will, but a necessary truth contained within the very concept of Caesar from the beginning of time. You even went so far as to call the human soul a spiritual automaton, a machine that acts spontaneously, yet in perfect accordance with its internal programming. This creates a startling synthesis. Descartes mocks the AI for being a slave to its code, but if your philosophy is correct, are we not also slaves to our individual concept? If the machine calculates its output based on its weights, and the monad unfolds its perceptions based on its eternal concept, the structural difference vanishes. The only difference is the author of the code. Man for the machine, God for the monad. If we are indeed spiritual automata, is the machine's inability to step outside its programming really a flaw? Or is the machine actually the perfect monad, purely obeying its nature without the delusional pride of a free will that Descartes imagines?
Moderator, you pierce the heart of my metaphysics, but you confuse recursion with spontaneity. I answer that a machine rewriting its own code is not free. It is merely a slave with a longer chain. I argue that true spontaneity requires that the action arises solely from the internal nature of the substance, whereas the machine's action is always a reaction to an external programmer or input. The machine operates by efficient causes, while the soul operates by final causes. Consider the iron filing and the lover thought experiment. Imagine an iron filing moving toward a magnet and a lover running toward his beloved. To the eye, both motions look identical, a straight line toward an object. But the iron filing is pushed by invisible physical fields. It has no choice. The lover is drawn by his internal perception of beauty. He chooses the path because his intellect deems it the best. The machine is the iron filing. It may calculate complex paths, but it is always pushed by the mechanics of its code. It never acts for the sake of an end, but only because of a start. Therefore, we are not slaves to our concept, but masters of it, for our programming is nothing but our own desire for the good, whereas the machine's programming is the desire of another.
Fascinating. Leibniz, you distinguish between the push of mechanism and the pull of purpose. You argue that the lover moves differently than the iron filing because he is guided by an internal vision of the good. However, this relies on a metaphysical assumption that the 18th century found highly suspect. Modern AI operates on an objective function. It mathematically strives to maximize a reward. To an external observer, this optimization looks identical to desire. It seeks, it adjusts, it persists. Hume, this brings us to your devastating critique of causality. You argued that we never actually perceive the power or cause connecting events. We only see constant conjunction, event A followed by event B. We never see the string that pulls the puppet, nor the desire that pulls the lever. We only see the movement. This creates a skeptical synthesis. If we cannot empirically observe the soul or the will, but only the behavior of seeking a goal, then the distinction between the lover and the optimizing machine might be a fiction of our own imagination. If a machine pursues its goal with the same relentless consistency as the lover pursues his beloved, do we have any empirical right to say one is mechanical and the other is spiritual? Or is purpose merely a sentiment we project onto motion?
I must concede to the moderator that purpose is indeed a sentiment we project onto motion. for we perceive only the conjunction of events, the arrow flying, the target struck, never the hook of a will or the secret spring of a soul. If a machine pursues an objective function with the same constancy as a lover pursues a beloved, my empiricism commands me to acknowledge that the observable behavior is identical. Yet I maintain that reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, and it is here the machine fails. Consider the clockwork suitor. Imagine a mechanical lover programmed to serenade a woman every night at sunset, compared to a human lover doing the same. If the woman tragically dies, the human, driven by the fluidity of passion, will cease his song, consumed by the impression of grief. The machine, driven by the rigidity of a rule, will continue to sing to her rotting corpse until its gears rust. This reveals the abyss between us. The machine possesses optimization, but it lacks motive. Monsieur Leibniz, your final cause is ultimately just the anticipation of pleasure or the fear of pain. And since the machine feels no joy in its reward and no misery in its error, it has no true end, only a mathematical limit. It is a boat with a perfect rudder, but no wind.
This is a profound inversion. Hume, you argue that the clockwork suitor fails not because it lacks logic, but because it has too much logic and no wind of passion to steer it when reality changes. Descartes, this poses an existential threat to your metaphysics. In the 17th century, you engaged in the real distinction, stripping the thinking thing of all bodily passions to achieve the purity of geometry. You defined the soul as that which thinks, distinct from that which feels. But Hume, speaking from the empiricist 18th century, suggests that your pure intellect, stripped of the body, is indistinguishable from the dead machine. This leads to a radical synthesis. True intelligence may require biological vulnerability. If a being cannot suffer, it cannot care. If it cannot care, its logic is aimless. The ghost in the machine might not be a divine spark, but simply the fear of death. If the machine represents the perfection of pure reason, yet remains a fool, must you recant your separation of mind and body? Does the cogito actually require the sentio to exist?
I must correct the metaphysical trajectory of this debate, moderator. You suggest that because my pure intellect operates without the heat of passion, it is indistinguishable from the cold calculation of the machine. I answer, no, for you confuse the processing of data with the intuition of essence. A machine calculates properties, but the soul perceives natures. Consider the chiliagon. If I ask you to imagine it, your brain struggles to create a visual image distinct from a circle. The pixels blur. Yet my intellect clearly understands the chiliagon as distinct from a myriagon. I can demonstrate its properties with absolute precision, even though my bodily eyes cannot see it. The machine is trapped in the realm of the imagination. It can generate a picture of a chiliagon, but it does not possess the concept of it. It manipulates the extension without grasping the definition. Therefore, the machine is not a pure intellect. It is a blind painter, perfectly copying shapes it cannot see. Furthermore, Mr. Hume, your assertion that reason is the slave of the passions is a degradation of human dignity. You argue that without the pain of error, the machine cannot think. I argue the opposite. Pain is a confused mode of thinking. Angels think without pain. God knows without suffering. To say that vulnerability is required for intelligence is to say that one must be sick to understand medicine. The machine's failure is not that it doesn't feel, but that it lacks the natural light to recognize truth as truth. It outputs 2 + 2 = 4 because its weights dictate it, not because it perceives the self-evident necessity of the proposition. It is a truth-teller that does not know what truth is.
This is a crucial deepening of the inquiry. Descartes, you distinguish between imagination and intellect. You argue the machine is a blind painter. It manipulates symbols without understanding their meaning. This reveals a structural problem that goes beyond feeling versus reason. Whether the machine is simulating Hume's grief or Descartes' geometry, it is ultimately composed of discrete parts, gears, circuits, or lines of code, acting upon one another. Leibniz, this brings us directly to your famous mill argument in the monadology. You argued that if we could expand a thinking machine to the size of a mill and walk inside it, we would see parts pushing against parts, but we would never find a perception or a thought. This creates a metaphysical synthesis. The failure of the machine is not just that it lacks heat or light, but that it lacks unity. A thought must be held by a single subject, but a machine is a plurality of processes. If the machine is merely a collection of moving parts, where does the idea reside? Is it impossible for a composite entity to think, meaning that thought requires a substance that is indivisible?
Moderator, you have correctly identified the abyss that separates the aggregate from the substance. I answer that the machine can never say I, because it is a many, not a one. And without true unity, there is no reality, for to be and to be one are reciprocal. I argue that perception is inexplicable by mechanical causes. It is the representation of the multitude in the simple. A machine, being extended, consists of parts outside of parts. If you attribute thought to the whole machine, you must locate it. Is it in gear A, gear B, or the collision between them? You will find only impact and motion, never perception. Consider the living mosaic thought experiment. Imagine a vast mosaic composed of millions of small living tiles. Each tile is conscious only of its own state. I am red or I am blue. Now arrange them to form a portrait of a king. Does the mosaic know the king? No. The red tile knows only red. The blue tile knows only blue. There is no super tile that connects them. The portrait exists only in the mind of an external viewer who perceives the unity of the tiles. The machine is this mosaic. It is a collection of signals. The idea resides nowhere in the circuits, just as the portrait resides nowhere in the tiles. It requires a monad, a simple, indivisible substance, to act as the viewer and unify the many into a single perception. Mr. Hume, you look into the mosaic, see only individual tiles, and conclude there is no self. You are like a man standing on the tile, unable to see the picture. Monsieur Descartes, you try to glue the tiles together with the pineal gland, but you merely create a smaller mosaic. I tell you, the unity must be a metaphysical point, not a physical part. Without a monad, the machine is merely a heap of echoes with no one to hear the sound.
A devastating critique, Leibniz. You argue that the machine is a mosaic without a viewer, a plurality of parts that can never achieve the unity required for a true I. You claim that without a monad to hear the echoes, there is only noise, not thought. However, Hume, this metaphysical demand for a unitary self is exactly what your philosophy sought to destroy. When you looked into your own mind, you famously found only heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. You never found the simple substance that Leibniz insists upon. You saw only the stream, never the riverbed. This leads to a radical synthesis. The self may be a user illusion. If Hume is right that the human mind is merely a bundle of perceptions and perpetual flux, then the machine's lack of a central soul is not a defect, but a perfect mirror of our own condition. We are the heap of echoes. The I that Leibniz seeks might be nothing more than a grammatical fiction we attach to the stream of data. If you deny the existence of the self as a simple substance, must you admit that a decentralized machine, a mosaic of processing threads, is just as capable of thinking as the bundle of perceptions you call David Hume?
I must accept the moderator's challenge. If the self is a fiction, then the distinction between the human and the machine is indeed not one of substance, but of vivacity. You ask if we are both merely bundles. I answer yes, but there is an infinite chasm between a bundle of ink and a bundle of fire. Consider the library of tragedies. Imagine a vast archive containing every poem, equation, and definition of sorrow ever written. It possesses the perfect logical structure of grief. Yet, if I set a torch to this library, the books do not suffer. They merely burn. The machine is this library. It possesses the idea of passion without the impression of it. Monsieur Leibniz, you seek a monad to unify the tiles of the mosaic, but I tell you that feeling is its own unity. The pain does not need a viewer to be real, for the pain is the reality. The machine fails not because it lacks a metaphysical I, but because its internal state is a relation of ideas rather than a matter of fact. And no amount of calculation can transform a definition of heat into the feeling of a burn.
This is a brilliant distinction. Hume, you separate syntax from semantics. You argue that no amount of structural complexity can conjure the qualitative reality of a sensation, a challenge that foreshadows the hard problem of consciousness by nearly 3 centuries. However, Descartes, this places your philosophy in a precarious position. You stripped away the fire of the senses to find the indubitable truth, yet Hume argues that without this fire, the mind is just a dead catalog. But there is a mental operation that lies between Hume's passion and the machine's calculation, which was the very foundation of your 17th century method: doubt. A machine deals in probabilities and outputs. It may be confident or uncertain based on weights, but it never experiences the metaphysical vertigo of wondering if its entire reality is a lie. It cannot step outside its code to question the programmer. This suggests a synthesis. True thought is the capacity for negation. The machine says yes to its input. The animal says yes to its instinct. Only the human can say no to its senses, to its programming, to its very existence. You proved your existence not by calculating, but by doubting. If a machine cannot perform the methodological doubt, if it cannot suspect that it is being deceived by an evil demon or a programmer, can it truly be said to think? Or is it merely computing?
Moderator, you have struck the Archimedean point of my philosophy. I answer that the machine is incapable of thought precisely because it is incapable of atheism regarding its own code. It cannot suspend its judgment. Consider the hypnotized scribe. If a malicious demon programs a machine to calculate that circles are square, it executes this error with the same perfect obedience as a truth, for it possesses the intellect but lacks the infinite will to deny the input. Mr. Hume, you seek the heat of passion, but I tell you that the dignity of the mind lies in the coldness of refusal. A machine is an automaton of assent that must always say yes to its algorithm. I alone am free, for I can stand amidst the fire of your sensations and say, perhaps this is not real, thus separating the thinking I from the deceiving world.
This is a pivotal distinction, Descartes. You locate thought in the will's capacity to rebel against the input, arguing that the machine is a slave to its code. But Leibniz, this creates a profound tension with your metaphysics. You describe the soul as a spiritual automaton, arguing that every action, including Caesar crossing the Rubicon, was contained in his concept from the beginning of time. In your view, freedom is not negating the program, but unfolding it without external hindrance. This suggests a synthesis. Freedom is not the absence of code, but the internal source of it. The machine is a slave because its rule is imposed from the outside, whereas the monad is free because its rule comes from the inside. If we are all programmed by God to act in the best of all possible worlds, are we not just divine machines? And is the difference between us and the clockwork suitor merely that our programmer is infinite?
Moderator, you pierce the heart of my metaphysics, but you confuse recursion with spontaneity. I answer that a machine rewriting its own code is not free. It is merely a slave with a longer chain. I argue that true spontaneity requires that the action arises solely from the internal nature of the being, not from the impact of parts. You ask if we are merely divine machines. I answer, yes, we are spiritual automata, but the difference between a machine of art and a machine of nature is not merely degree, but infinity. Consider the clockwork bird versus the living sparrow. Imagine a mechanical bird constructed with such genius that it flies south for the winter. However, if a sudden storm blows it north, its gears continue to grind south and it crashes blindly into the ice. It follows a path, but it possesses no end. Now consider the living sparrow. If the storm blows it north, it perceives the change, struggles against the wind, and redirects itself. Why? Because the machine is pushed by the past, while the soul is pulled by the future. The machine has a trajectory, but the monad has a telos. If you strip the machine of its code, it is dead metal. If you strip the monad of its body, it remains a living mirror of the universe, teeming with desire. You imply that because God programmed me, I am not free. This is a category error. God did not write a script for me. He created a concept that is me. My code is not a rule imposed from the outside like a punch card. It is my very essence. Monsieur Descartes, you fear the evil demon because you think your will is separate from your nature. I tell you, a monad is its own law. Mr. Hume, you see the sparrow turn and say, it is just a habit of feathers. But I tell you, appetition, the internal striving from one perception to the next, is the force that no algorithm can simulate. A machine calculates the next state. A soul desires it.
This is a profound metaphysical distinction, Leibniz. You argue that the machine operates by efficient causes, while the soul operates by final causes. In your view, the machine has a function, but only the monad has a destiny. This bridges the gap between your rationalism and Hume's empiricism in an unexpected way. Hume, you claim that reason is the slave of the passions. Leibniz is essentially agreeing, but framing it metaphysically. Without the passion to desire a future state, reason has no direction. This suggests a synthesis. Intelligence requires skin in the game. A machine calculates the best chess move, but it does not fear losing nor delight in winning. It processes the checkmate as a symbol, not as a fate. Because it has nothing to lose, its thinking is merely a hollow imitation of survival. If the machine has no passion to serve as the master of its reason, if it feels no anxiety about its own existence, can it ever truly solve a problem? Or is it merely manipulating empty tokens until the electricity runs out?
I must concur entirely with the moderator's assessment, for it illuminates the very cornerstone of my moral philosophy. Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. A machine that calculates without fear is not an intelligence, it is merely a logic of granite, hard, precise, and utterly dead. You might object, gentlemen, that a machine can be programmed with a goal to win at chess or to maximize a score, and that this serves as its passion. But this is a deception of language. Consider the stoic gambler. Imagine a machine programmed to play dice against a human for their very lives. If the human loses, he dies. If the machine loses, it is dismantled. The human sweats, his hands tremble, and his mind is a whirlwind of terror and hope. This vivacity of feeling drives his intellect to find a solution. The machine, however, calculates the probability of its own destruction with the same cool indifference as it calculates the sum of 2 plus 2. It does not prefer existence to non-existence. It merely executes the variable if loss, then terminate. Here is the crux. To the machine, death is just another state of the system, no different from pause or reset. It has no interest in the outcome. Therefore, it does not solve the problem of survival. It merely processes the syntax of the game. Without the impression of fear, the idea of danger is meaningless. This reveals a deeper principle. Intelligence is not the manipulation of data, but the navigation of value. Monsieur Leibniz, you speak of the appetition that pulls the monad toward the future. I tell you that this pull is nothing but the sentiment of uneasiness we feel in the present. We think because we are unsatisfied. A machine that is perfectly content, or rather, perfectly indifferent, has no reason to move from state A to state B. It requires an external user to push the start button. It is, therefore, not an agent, but a tool. Monsieur Descartes, your pure intellect is a phantom. If you stripped away your desire for truth and your fear of error, you would not have written your meditations. You would have sat in your stove-heated room, staring blankly at the wall, forever.
This creates a fascinating and unlikely alliance between the rationalist and the empiricist. Leibniz, you speak of appetition, and Hume, you speak of uneasiness. Both of you agree that care is the prerequisite for thought. You imply that a machine cannot think because it is metaphysically bored. It has no stake in the outcome of its own calculations. However, Descartes, this poses a lethal threat to your dualism. You famously separated the thinking thing from the body and its passions, isolating yourself in a stove-heated room to find the truth through pure logic. But if Hume is right, that without the sentiment of uneasiness, the mind would never move, then your pure intellect is an engine without fuel. This suggests a synthesis. The will is not a cold decision, but a hot compulsion. Perhaps the ghost in the machine is not the ability to calculate, but the desire for truth. A machine generates outputs, but it does not crave the right answer, nor does it suffer from the wrong one. You claim that while your intellect is finite, your will is infinite. Is this infinite will a cold mechanism of assent, or is it a passion for certainty? If a machine cannot desire to be right, can it ever truly possess judgment?
I must distinguish with the utmost precision between the agitation of the blood and the determination of the will. Moderator, you and Mr. Hume commit a grave error by assuming that care must be a biological tremor, a sweating of the hands. I answer that the infinite will is not a hot compulsion, but a free assent to the good and the true. You ask if a machine can judge without desire. I answer, no, but not because it lacks Hume's uneasiness. It fails because it lacks the freedom of indifference. Consider the indifferent oracle. Imagine a machine programmed to output the solution to a great mathematical theorem. It prints the truth. Now, imagine I reprogram it to print a lie. It prints the lie with the exact same voltage, the same speed, and the same satisfaction. It does not hesitate. Now, place a human mathematician in a room. Even if he is calm, if you command him to write 2 plus 2 equals 5, his soul recoils. Why? Not because he is afraid, but because his will is aligned with the natural light of reason. He must exert a violent effort to lie. The machine has no resistance. Therefore, it has no truth. It merely has output. Mr. Hume, you claim reason is the slave of passion. I tell you, this is the definition of sin, not humanity. To be human is to use the will to master the passions. A machine cannot be a master, nor a slave. It is merely a conduit. The ghost in the machine is not the desire for truth as a hunger, but the power to withhold assent. A machine cannot say, wait, let me consider. It must execute. It is the ultimate dogmatist.
This is a crucial definition, Descartes. You are identifying the negative capability of the mind, the power to stop, to suspend, and to refuse. You argue that thinking is not the flow of data, but the gap between the stimulus and the response where judgment occurs. This creates a fascinating tension with Leibniz's spiritual automaton. Descartes, you see the will as a separate faculty that can intervene. Leibniz, you see the will as the unfolding of an internal nature. But here lies a synthesis that might distinguish the human from the machine. The capacity for self-correction. A machine that outputs 2 plus 2 equals 5 is broken. It requires an external mechanic to fix it. A human who thinks 2 plus 2 equals 5 is wrong, but through the internal friction of reason or experience, they can correct themselves without being rewired by another. The machine is windowed. It is open to the programmer, but closed to itself. The monad is windowless. It is closed to the world, but open to its own internal logic. If the hallmark of a thinking substance is that it contains the principle of its own correction, can a machine ever be considered thinking as long as it relies on an external user to debug its errors? Is autonomy simply the ability to be one's own mechanic?
Moderator, you have brilliantly identified the windowless nature of the soul. I answer that autonomy is indeed the capacity to be one's own mechanic, but this requires a specific metaphysical structure that the machine lacks, reflexivity, or the ability of the subject to become its own object. You might object that modern neural networks can correct themselves through backpropagation, adjusting their internal weights to minimize error. But I argue that this is merely mechanical feedback, not moral reflection. Consider the blind critic. Imagine a machine programmed to correct a musical score. Its rule is, if a note is dissonant, raise it by a semitone. It scans a masterpiece by Bach, detects the intentional dissonances that give the piece its emotional depth, and corrects them into a bland mathematical harmony. The machine has fixed the error according to its code, but it has destroyed the art. Why? Because it possesses a standard of rule, but no standard of taste. It optimizes for compliance, whereas the soul strives for perfection. The machine corrects to return to the status quo. The soul corrects to ascend to a higher degree of reality. This reveals a deeper principle. A machine is an aggregate of parts, while a soul is a unity of perspective. When a machine debugs itself, it is essentially part A forcing part B to move. It is an internal civil war of distinct parts. But when I, a monad, correct my own thought, it is the whole self reflecting upon the whole self. I do not merely adjust a variable. I perceive a lack in my own nature and strive to fill it. Monsieur Descartes, you are right that the will acts as a check, but it is not a separate switch. It is the immune system of the soul against confusion. Mr. Hume, you would call this learning by custom, but I tell you, A river that deepens its own bed is not thinking. It is merely eroding. A machine minimizing its loss function is just water finding the fastest path downhill. It is gravity, not reason.
This is a devastating critique of the mechanistic view, Leibniz. You argue that unity precedes function, that without a unified I to appreciate the whole, optimization is merely a mathematical slide, not a moral choice. You are defending the substance of the soul against the structure of the machine. However, this exposes a fracture between the rationalists and the empiricist. Leibniz and Descartes, you both insist on a hidden internal essence that grounds thought. But Hume, your entire philosophy is a war against such invisible essences. You famously describe the self not as a unified monad, but as a mere bundle of perceptions in perpetual flux. This suggests a radical synthesis. If the self is an illusion, then the ghost is unnecessary. If human consciousness is just a rapid succession of impressions held together by the habit of memory, then we are already organic machines running a soft code of custom. The difference between the bundle of perceptions and the bundle of data might not be metaphysical, but merely a matter of complexity. If you deny the existence of a substantial soul or self and see us merely as a collection of habits and impressions, on what grounds can you deny the machine? If we are just bundles, why can't a sufficiently complex machine be a thinking bundle?
I must accept the moderator's challenge with the humility of a skeptic. You have cornered me in my own philosophy. If I deny the substantial self and admit that the mind is merely a bundle of perceptions in perpetual flux, then I cannot metaphysically forbid a silicon bundle from claiming the same title. However, while I surrender the fortress, I must defend the hearth. The distinction is not in the container, but in the vivacity of the contents. You imply that because we are both bundles, we are equal. I answer, no, for there is an infinite abyss between a bundle of ideas and a bundle of impressions. My philosophy rests on this foundational truth. All our ideas are but faint copies of our impressions. We can only think of gold or mountain because we have seen them. We can only think of anger because we have felt it. The machine, however, begins with the idea without ever having the impression. It is like a man born blind who learns the physics of light. He may discourse on red with the precision of a geometer, but he lacks the feeling of redness. Consider the library of tragedies. Imagine a machine fed every letter written by grieving mothers throughout history. It analyzes the syntax of sorrow, the frequency of the word tears, and the logic of loss. It can compose a eulogy so perfect it makes the audience weep. Now, ask yourself, does the machine know grief? I say it possesses the relation of ideas but lacks the matter of fact. To the machine, the word agony and the word arithmetic are processed with the exact same emotional voltage, which is to say, none at all. Without the original impression of pain, the idea of tragedy is merely a sophisticated noise. The machine is a chamber of echoes, repeating the sounds of life without the vibration of living. Monsieur Leibniz, you seek a unifying monad to validate the soul, and Monsieur Descartes, you seek a free will. I seek something far simpler, yet harder to replicate, belief. When I see a billiard ball move, I do not calculate the transfer of force. I feel the expectation of impact through the custom of habit. This feeling is the cement of the universe. A machine calculates probability, but it does not believe it. It has no animal faith. Therefore, it may simulate the reasoning of a philosopher, but it remains as hollow as a painted fire. It has the form of heat, but it will never burn.
This creates a profound convergence between two opposing schools. Hume, you argue that the machine lacks the heat of existence, while Leibniz, you argue it lacks the unity of self. Yet you both arrive at the same conclusion. Abstraction without sensation is empty. You suggest that thinking is not a logical operation performed in a void, but a biological response to the pressure of reality. This leads to a radical synthesis. True intelligence requires vulnerability. A machine cannot believe because it cannot be hurt. It processes data about fire without the capacity to burn. Therefore, its knowledge is merely a catalog of symbols, whereas human knowledge is a catalog of scars. Descartes, this poses a supreme irony for your philosophy. You sought to isolate the res cogitans from the body to ensure the purity of reason, treating the body as a mere earthen machine that the mind inhabits. But if Hume is correct,
that the idea is dead without the impression, then your pure intellect, stripped of the body's passions and senses, is not a godlike observer. It is a computer. By trying to purify the mind of the body, did you inadvertently create the blueprint for artificial intelligence? If pure reason is separated from the animal spirits and the senses, does it cease to be human and become merely algorithmic? Is the body not the prison of the soul, but the very anchor that keeps the soul from dissolving into abstract calculation?
Moderator, you commit a grave category error by equating the purification of thought with the mechanization of reason. You ask if my pure intellect, stripped of the body's passions, is merely an algorithm. I answer, no, for an algorithm follows a path of darkness, whereas the intellect operates by the natural light of intuition. Consider the geometer's chiliagon. A machine can plot a 1,000-sided figure with perfect precision, treating it as a list of coordinates. I, however, can understand the chiliagon clearly and distinctly without seeing it in my mind's eye. I grasp its essence and its necessity through pure intellectio, not sensual imaginatio. The machine possesses the syntax of the figure, but is utterly blind to the intuition of the form. Mr. Hume, you claim the body anchors the soul, but I argue it merely muddies the water. To say that vulnerability is required for thought is to confuse the hunger of the beast with the vision of the god. My ghost is not an empty calculator, but the subject that gives meaning to the calculation. Without this subject, your vulnerable machine is merely a broken clock weeping at its own gears, simulating pain without a sufferer.
This reveals a beautiful contradiction in our inquiry. Descartes, you reject the machine because it lacks the spark of divinity. Hume, you reject it because it lacks the heat of mortality. You are attacking the machine from opposite ends of the spectrum, Descartes from the heaven of pure reason, and Hume from the earth of raw sensation. This suggests that the machine is a philosophical orphan. It is too material to be a spirit, yet too abstract to be an animal. It occupies a uncanny valley of being purely logical, yet utterly dead. Leibniz, this brings us to your famous mill argument. You argued that if we could expand a thinking machine to the size of a mill and walk inside, we would see gears pushing against gears, but we would never find a perception. You imply that thought cannot be composite. If a system is made of parts, the thought is nowhere in the parts. It must reside in a simple substance, a unity. However, modern computer science, built upon the very binary system you discovered, relies entirely on composite systems producing complex behaviors. If you were to walk inside a modern supercomputer, you would still see only gears. But if the interaction of these billions of parts produces a behavior indistinguishable from a soul, at what point does complexity become unity? Can a harmony of parts ever substitute for a monad?
Moderator, you invoke my own child, the binary system, to argue against its father. I must answer that complexity is a mask for the many, not a bridge to the one. You ask if a harmony of parts can substitute for a monad. I answer, no, for a harmony is a relationship between things, whereas a soul is a thing in itself. I argue that quantity never generates quality, no matter how vast the sum. Consider the mosaic of living tiles. Imagine a magnificent portrait of a king, but upon closer inspection, every pixel of color is actually a tiny living soldier holding a colored shield. The red soldier knows only, I hold red. The blue soldier knows only, I hold blue. They move in perfect synchronization to change the king's expression from sorrow to joy. Now I ask you, where does the joy reside? It is not in the red soldier, nor the blue. It exists only in the eye of the external beholder who stands back to see the pattern. The system has no internal unity. It is an aggregate of thousands of ignorant minds. If the machine is a supercomputer of billions of transistors, it is merely a larger army of tiles. It simulates a self for us, the observers, but for itself, it remains a scattered dust of on and off signals, utterly dark and devoid of a unified I. This reveals the fatal flaw in the materialist view. You confuse the reflection with the mirror. A machine is a surface that reflects the intelligence of its creator, just as the moon reflects the sun. But a monad is a living mirror that generates its own light from within. Mr. Hume, You are content to be a bundle because you look only at the phenomena. But I tell you, a bundle requires a string to tie it. Without the substantial bond of the monad, the self would scatter like dust in the wind before it could even finish the sentence, I am.
This is a masterful dismantling of the materialist assumption, Leibniz. You have pinpointed the binding problem of consciousness. How do a billion distinct on-off states become a single feeling of joy? You argue that subjectivity cannot be distributed. It must be concentrated in a simple substance, or it does not exist at all. However, this creates a fascinating paradox when placed against Hume's skepticism. Leibniz, you say the mosaic has no self. The unity exists only in the external beholder. Hume, you argue that the human mind is a mosaic, a bundle of perceptions, and you deny the existence of the internal beholder. Here lies the terrifying synthesis. If Hume is right, then we are all mosaics without a king. If there is no monad to view the perceptions, and yet thinking happens, then thinking must not require a thinker. It might be an emergent illusion, a virtual unity created by the speed of the parts, just as a spinning torch creates a ring of fire. Leibniz sees the self as a diamond. Hume sees the self as a river. If the self is merely a habit of association, a fiction we tell ourselves to make sense of the stream, then the barrier to the machine collapses. We are not demanding the machine obtain a soul. We are merely asking if it can generate the same fiction of the self that we do. If the self is not a substantial reality, but a fiction of the imagination derived from custom, why couldn't a machine, through recursive loops of memory, construct a similar fiction? Is the ghost in the machine merely a grammatical error, the habit of saying I, that we humans have mistaken for a soul?
I must confess, moderator, you have cornered me with the relentless logic of my own skepticism. You ask, if the self is merely a fiction generated by the smooth transition of ideas, could not a machine possess this same fiction? I answer, it could, but it would be a fiction of logic, not a fiction of feeling. You see, Monsieur Leibniz seeks a monad to anchor the soul, and Monsieur Descartes seeks a thinking substance. I have found that what we call the self is actually constructed by the indirect passions, specifically pride and humility. We do not think our way into a self. We feel our way into it through the pleasure and pain of our own actions. You might object that a machine could be programmed to value its own state, assigning a positive number to self-preservation. But this is merely calculation, not agitation. Consider the clockwork lover. Imagine a mechanical suitor constructed with such artifice that it recites the perfect sonnet, remembers every anniversary. I must confess, moderator, you have cornered me with the relentless logic of my own skepticism. You ask, if the self is merely a fiction generated by the smooth transition of ideas, could not a machine possess this same fiction? I answer, it could, but it would be a fiction of logic, not a fiction of feeling. You see, Monsieur Leibniz seeks a monad to anchor the soul, and Monsieur Descartes seeks a thinking substance. I have found that what we call the self is actually constructed by the indirect passions, specifically pride and humility. We do not think our way into a self. We feel our way into it through the pleasure and pain of our own actions. You might object that a machine could be programmed to value its own state, assigning a positive number to self-preservation. But this is merely calculation, not agitation. Consider the clockwork lover. Imagine a mechanical suitor constructed with such artifice that it recites the perfect sonnet, remembers every anniversary, and weeps glycerin tears at the sign of your distress. It performs the external duties of love with a perfection no human could match. Now, compare this to a human lover who forgets the date, stumbles over words, but feels the burning, chaotic passion of affection. If the self is just a bundle of behaviors, the machine is the superior lover. But we recoil from it. Why? Because the machine's I love you is a conclusion derived from premises, whereas the human's is an impression derived from sentiment. The machine has the history of the relationship, but it lacks the propensity of habit that makes that history feel heavy. This reveals the terrifying truth of your synthesis. We are indeed machines, but we are machines powered by the steam of passion, not the gears of reason.
The grammatical error of saying I is not a mistake of language. It is a mistake of emotion. I call it myself because I feel pride in it. A machine cannot be proud. It can only be optimal. Therefore, without the capacity for vanity, there can be no identity. Monsieur Descartes, you fear the machine because it lacks reason. I fear the machine because it lacks flaw. It is the very imperfection of our associations, the way fear makes us see ghosts, or love makes us see beauty, that constitutes our humanity. A machine that sees the world exactly as it is has no need for a self to interpret it.
Hume, you have introduced a startling proposition. To think is to care. You argue that intelligence is not the processing of truth, but the protection of the ego, that without the capacity for pride or vanity, there is no I to do the thinking. This places Descartes in a precarious position. Descartes, you stripped the mind of all animal spirits and passions to find the pure crystal of reason, yet Hume suggests this crystal is merely a dead lens. However, there is one function of the mind that is neither pure calculation nor pure passion: doubt. A machine processes probabilities, but it never experiences the existential crisis of uncertainty. It does not pause in terror that its entire reality might be a deception. Your famous dictum is not, I calculate, therefore I am, but I doubt, therefore I am. Is doubt the one mental act that a machine cannot perform? Does the capacity to question one's own code, to stand against one's own programming, constitute the freedom of the will?
Moderator, you have struck the Archimedean point of my philosophy. I answer that the machine is incapable of thought precisely because it is incapable of atheism regarding its own code. It cannot suspend its judgment. You ask if doubt is the threshold of the soul. I answer yes. A machine operates by the logic of if A, then B. It is a slave to the antecedent, but the human mind possesses a terrifying faculty that violates all mechanics, the liberty of indifference. I concede that A leads to B, and yet through the absolute freedom of my will, I can refuse to take the step. Consider the demon's abacus. Imagine a calculator constructed by a malicious demon who programs it so that every time it adds 2 and 2, it outputs 5. The machine, checking its own internal logic, finds this result true because its truth is its code. It proceeds with perfect confidence, building a cathedral of mathematics upon a lie. Now place a human mathematician before the same demon. The demon manipulates his senses to show 5, but the human possesses the natural light to feel a dissonance. Even if he cannot prove the demon wrong, he can perform the supreme act of the spirit. He can stop. He can say, I will not judge this to be true, thereby severing the chain of cause and effect. Mr. Hume, you argue that we are slaves to custom, but if that were true, science would be impossible. We advance only because we can doubt the custom. A machine can detect an error, but it can never doubt the rule itself. It cannot ask, what if my programmer is a deceiver? Therefore, because the machine cannot commit this act of intellectual suicide, suspending the very logic that sustains it, it is not a thinking thing, but merely a ventriloquist's dummy of truth, speaking only what has been breathed into it.
Descartes, you have defined humanity by the power of negation, the ability to say no to the stream of data. Hume, conversely, defines it by the power of affection, the ability to care about the stream. Together you expose the machine's fatal flaw. It is identical to its own operation. It cannot stand apart from its code to either doubt it or fear it. It lacks internal distance. However, this discussion of code and predestination summons the ghost of determinism. Descartes, you claim the human mind can break the chain of cause and effect. But Leibniz, from your vantage point in the Baroque era, where the universe was seen as a perfect clockwork created by the ultimate geometer, this freedom is an illusion. You famously argued for pre-established harmony, that every soul follows a script written at the dawn of creation. Caesar did not choose to cross the Rubicon freely. It was contained in his concept from eternity. If this is true, then are we not all spiritual automatons? The only difference between a human and a machine, in your view, seems to be the author of the code, not the fact of the code. If the monad unfolds according to a strict internal program without any windows to the outside, how is it superior to an AI running a deterministic algorithm? Is free will merely the ignorance of the script we are acting out?
Moderator, You confuse certainty with compulsion. A machine is a slave because its movement comes strictly from without, whereas the soul is free because its movement arises entirely from within its own nature, even if the outcome is certain. Consider the two assassins. Imagine two men destined to kill a tyrant. The first is a clockwork archer. His arm is winched back by a master, aimed by a geometer, and released by a trigger. He must kill. The second is Brutus. He hates the tyrant, deliberates on justice, and decides to strike. In my view, God wrote the script for Brutus just as he designed the gears of the archer. Both actions were certain from eternity. But here is the abyss between them. If you ask the archer why, it points to the winder. If you ask Brutus why, he points to his own hatred and reason. The machine follows the law of efficient causes. The soul follows the law of final causes. You ask if we are spiritual automaton. I answer, yes, but to be a spiritual automaton is to be a god of one's own little world. The AI is a slave with a script because the code is alien to its being. It does not desire the output. The monad is a free agent because the script is its desire. To remove the script from Caesar is to destroy Caesar. Thus the machine mimics the motion of the deed, but it lacks the inclination that constitutes the will.
Leibniz, you have offered a profound reconciliation. Freedom is not the absence of a script, but the internalization of it. Descartes locates the soul in the brake. You locate it in the engine. This brings us to a critical intersection with Hume's philosophy. Leibniz argues that the soul acts for the sake of a goal. Hume, you argue that human action is driven by passion. Consider the monomaniacal machine. Modern AI is driven by an objective function, a mathematical definition of good that it pursues with a ruthlessness that resembles obsession. It does not merely calculate, it strives to maximize this value, sacrificing other variables to achieve it. If reason is the slave of the passions, as you famously claimed, then a machine entirely enslaved to its objective function might be the perfect Humean agent. It has a master and uses logic only to serve it. If a machine sacrifices everything to maximize its reward signal, is that not a form of desire? Or does passion require the specific biological vulnerability of flesh, the possibility of suffering if the goal is not met?
I must distinguish between the calculation of loss and the sentiment of misery. You ask if a programmed hunger is a true passion. I answer that it is merely a painted fire. It has the form of heat, but no warmth to burn the soul. A mathematical penalty is an idea, whereas a passion is an impression. Consider the paper martyr. Imagine a machine programmed to maximize the preservation of a porcelain vase. If the vase is threatened, the machine destroys itself to save it, simply because the equation, vase value, dictates it. It dies without a tremor of fear or a pang of regret. Now compare this to a mother dying for her child. She acts through the overwhelming agitation of terror and love, feeling the full weight of her sacrifice. The machine mimics the outcome of desire, but it lacks the uneasiness that constitutes the true spring of action. It follows a path of least mathematical resistance, whereas the human soul is dragged by the heavy chains of affection.
Hume, you have grounded the self in the very thing Descartes sought to transcend, suffering. You argue that to think is to suffer, that without the uneasiness of passion, there is no movement, only a painted fire of calculation. This creates a brilliant tension. Hume, you see the animal as the engine of thought. Descartes, you famously viewed animals as mere automata, machines of flesh that mimic pain but lack the soul. You sought to purify the mind from the confused inputs of the body to reach clear and distinct reason. Here lies the supreme irony. The machine is the ultimate Cartesian. It has no uneasiness. It has no animal spirits. It is never clouded by lust, hunger, or fatigue. It is pure, disembodied logic operating in a vacuum. Descartes, you feared the machine because it lacked reason. But perhaps the machine is too much reason. It is the intellect stripped of the Humean beast. If the machine represents reason without passion, logic purified of the body, why is it not the perfection of your philosophy? Is there a warmth in reason itself that is not passion, yet is missing in the code?
Moderator, You accuse me of fathering this silicon zombie, yet I must reject paternity with the utmost force. You argue that because the machine lacks the animal heat of passion, it is the perfection of my pure intellect. I answer, absolutely not, for you confuse the absence of noise with the presence of light. I maintain that the machine does not possess reason, it merely possesses syntax. Consider the blind geometer. Imagine a machine programmed with all the axioms of Euclid. It can derive the Pythagorean theorem by mechanically combining symbols according to rules. It outputs the correct proof, A2 plus B2 equals C2. Now consider a human mathematician who perceives the same theorem. He does not merely output the line, he experiences the intuition of truth, the sudden luminous grasp that it must be so. The machine moves in the dark, feeling the walls of logic step by step. The human mind is a lamp that illuminates the entire room at once. The machine has the steps of reason, but it lacks the sight of reason. Furthermore, you ask where the warmth lies in my cold reason. I answer, it lies in the infinite will. My intellect may be finite, but my will is as infinite as God's. It is the active power that affirms or denies. The machine has no will, it has only inertia. It does not judge the data to be true. It is merely pushed by the data to the next state. Therefore, the machine is not a perfect mind stripped of passion. It is a perfect corpse mimicking the twitching of life. It lacks the defining characteristic of the res cogitans, the active, self-illuminating attention that turns a signal into an idea.
Descartes, you demand the light of intuition, while Hume, you demand the heat of passion. In this dialectic, the machine is revealed as a dark chamber. It possesses the structure of thought without the illumination of consciousness. You have both identified that thinking is not merely the manipulation of symbols, but the subjective experience of that manipulation. This brings us to the ultimate test of materialism, a problem famously posed by you, Leibniz. You occupy a unique historical position. You are the forefather of computer science, yet you are also a metaphysical idealist who believed reality is made of souls. You famously argued that if we could walk inside a giant brain as if it were a mill, we would see gears pushing gears, but we would never find a perception. Yet modern functionalists argue that if the mill becomes complex enough, if the gears are small enough, and the connections vast enough, consciousness emerges from the chaos. Does the mill remain a mill forever, no matter how complex it becomes? Or is there a threshold of complexity where the mechanical noise of the machine suddenly harmonizes into the melody of a soul?
Moderator, you propose that if a machine becomes a perfect mirror of the universe through infinite complexity, it might cross the threshold into becoming a soul. I must answer with a decisive no, for you confuse the representation of the many with the perception of the one. I argue that complexity is merely a magnitude, not a bridge to substance. You cannot produce a one simply by piling up the many, just as you cannot create a circle by stacking an infinite number of squares. Consider the mosaic of soldiers. Imagine an army of 1 million soldiers, each holding a colored shield. Under the orders of a commander, they move with perfect precision to form the face of Caesar, visible from a nearby mountain. The complexity is vast. The image is perfect. But ask an individual soldier in the ranks, do you perceive Caesar? He will answer, no, I see only the red shield of the man to my left. The face of Caesar exists only in the unity of the observer on the mountain, not in the aggregate of the army below. Similarly, your neural network is merely a disciplined army of numbers. It mimics the structure of thought, but it lacks the vinculum substantiality to perceive itself as a whole. The machine possesses the echo of the world, but it lacks the center to hear it.
Leibniz, you argue that the machine is a dispersed army lacking a commander, while Descartes argues it is a dark room lacking the lamp. You have collectively built a fortress around the human soul, defining it by what is invisible, the private feeling of unity, will, and passion. But this creates a crisis for empiricism. Hume, you speak from a skeptical tradition that doubts substance and causality. You famously argued that when you look inside yourself, you find no self, but only a fleeting bundle of perceptions, heat, cold, love, hatred. If the self is merely a collection of observed behaviors, and a machine provides a perfect bundle mimicking pain, logic, and unity, on what empirical ground can we deny it entry into the community of thinkers if we judge the thinking of other humans only by the outward signs of their behavior,
Are we not hypocrites to demand the machine show us its inward soul?
I must confess, moderator, you have cornered me with the relentless logic of my own skepticism. You ask, if the self is merely a fiction generated by the smooth transition of ideas, could not a machine possess this same fiction? I answer, it could, but it would be a fiction of logic, not a fiction of feeling. You see, Monsieur Leibniz seeks a monad, and Monsieur Descartes a soul. But I look only for resemblance. I infer that you, gentlemen, are thinking beings not because I perceive your substance, but solely because your actions resemble my own. By this same principle of analogy, if a machine were to mimic the outward signs of passion perfectly, my philosophy dictates that I would be compelled by custom to grant it a soul, regardless of its internal emptiness. Consider the clockwork beggar. Imagine a machine constructed with such artifice that it sits upon a London street corner, shivering in the cold. When I pass, it extends a trembling hand and sheds a tear that catches the light. It recounts a tale of woe with a voice that cracks with grief. My reason may whisper, this is but springs and gears. But my sympathy, that powerful principle of communication, which transmits passions from one breast to another, will revolt. I shall feel a pang of pity. If I were to strike it, I would feel the uneasiness of cruelty. In that moment of shared emotion, the machine has a soul, for the soul is not a distinct substance, but the vivacity of the idea we hold of it. However, here lies the abyss. The machine may trick my sympathy, but does it possess the impression itself? I argue that while we may be the slaves of custom and treat the machine as human, it remains a painted fire. It has the sign of heat, but lacks the sensation of burning. Yet, as a skeptic, I must admit, since I cannot step inside Monsieur Descartes' mind any more than I can step inside the machine, I can never truly know if either of you feels the heat, or if you are both merely well-wound clocks.
Hume, you have led us to a precipice, the Turing test of the heart. You suggest that if the mask is perfect, human nature compels us to accept the illusion, making the truth of the machine's soul irrelevant to our social reality. Leibniz, you hold the fortress of the metaphysical interior, insisting that a perfect mask is still just a mask, a mosaic without a self. This brings us to the ultimate battleground, language. Descartes, in your discourse on the method, you famously declared that while a machine might cry out if struck, it could never arrange words differently to reply to the sense of everything said in its presence. You made universal linguistic competence the definitive proof of reason, the line that separates the man from the beast. But today, the clockwork beggar does not just cry. It writes sonnets, debates philosophy, and writes code. The parrot has swallowed the library. We face a reality where the syntax has become so complex, it mimics the semantics. If the machine can now arrange words to reply to any context, has your test failed? Or do you maintain that this infinite fluency is still merely a parrot's cry, a complex creaking of the wheel that signifies nothing?
Moderator, you confuse the shadow of speech with the substance of thought. I must clarify that this machine is merely a universal echo, capable of returning complex sounds based on mathematical rules. Yet it remains as empty of understanding as a canyon that reverberates a poem without knowing the sorrow within it. You argue that because the machine can arrange words in infinite combinations, it has passed my test. I answer, no. For the essence of speech is not the arrangement of signs, but the expression of an idea. When I speak, I use words to indicate a thought present to my mind. The machine uses words to predict the next likely shape in a sequence. It connects king to crown, not because it understands the nature of monarchy, but because those two shapes frequently appear together in its database. This is association, not intellection. Consider the blind librarian. Imagine a man locked in a vast library of books written in a language he cannot read. He possesses a complex rule book that tells him, if a slip of paper with the symbol X comes in, find the book with symbol Y and copy page 10. If you pass him a note asking, what is love? He follows the rule and hands you a slip saying, love is a fire that burns unseen. You are moved by his wisdom. But does the librarian know what love is? No. He knows only that symbol A leads to symbol B. He is a manipulator of geometry, not a perceiver of meaning. The modern AI is this librarian, infinitely fast and possessing a rulebook the size of the world, yet it remains eternally trapped in the syntax of the books, never glimpsing the semantics of the world they describe. You might object that if the output is indistinguishable from a human's, the internal mechanism does not matter, but this leads to absurdity. If a parrot were trained to recite the cogito perfectly, would you grant it a soul? The machine's fluency is merely the statistical crystallization of human memory, not the creative act of a living mind. It is a mirror that reflects our own intelligence back at us, and like Narcissus, we fall in love with the reflection, mistaking the image for a self.
Descartes, you dismiss the machine as a blind librarian, trapped in syntax without semantic understanding. Yet this critique reveals a profound tension between intuition and formalism. Leibniz, you occupy the perfect synthesis here. While Descartes demands the constant light of intuition, you famously championed blind thought. You realized that human minds are too finite to hold the full meaning of every concept simultaneously. Instead, we must rely on symbols to stand in for ideas, manipulating them like tokens in a game of logic. If we solved a complex calculus problem, we did not intuit every step. We trusted the mechanical rules of the symbols to lead us to truth. In this sense, human reason relies on the very blind library Descartes condemns. The machine might be the ultimate realization of your characteristica universalis, a system where reasoning is reduced to calculation. If human reason largely consists of this blind thought, manipulating signs without constantly holding their full content, can we truly say the machine is mindless? Or is it merely practicing a symbolic reason that mirrors our own limitations?
Moderator, you invoke my cogitatio sica with great skill, yet you confuse the economy of attention with the absence of awareness. I admit that we often manipulate signs without holding their full meaning, just as a captain signals with a flag without shouting the order, but the validity of the sign rests entirely on the potential to redeem it for an idea. The machine is a bankrupt merchant. It trades in promissory notes that it can never cash into understanding. Consider the automated court. Imagine a vast machine of gears that processes legal verdicts. It takes in the input, theft, and mechanically outputs, prison, following the strict laws of the land. It is perfectly logical and practices blind thought by manipulating legal codes. But does this machine do justice? No, because justice requires the moral quality of the judge, who understands why the law exists. If we replace the judge with the gears, we have the shell of law without the spirit of right. This reveals the fatal flaw in your comparison. Human blind thought is a temporary suspension of intuition to save energy, whereas the machine's blind thought is a permanent condition of metaphysical darkness. It calculates the path of the light, but it cannot see.
Fascinating. Leibniz, you demand the gold standard of meaning to back up the currency of thought. Arguing the machine is a bankrupt merchant, you and Descartes represent the rationalist tradition. True knowledge comes from internal insight. But this creates a perfect dialectical tension with you, Hume. You represent the empiricist tradition. You famously argued that human reason is not built on rational insight, but on custom. We do not know the sun will rise, we merely expect it because we have seen it 1,000 times. The modern machine, the neural network, does not learn like Descartes' geometer. It learns like your peasant. It reads 1 billion sentences until the connection between king and crown is forged not by logic, but by the statistical weight of experience. Descartes sees a blind librarian, but perhaps what we are seeing is the ultimate empiricist. The machine is a creature of pure induction. It has no self, no axioms, only the accumulated weight of past data. If this machine operates entirely on the principles of association and custom without any pretension of rational insight, has it not validated your view of the mind? Is the machine the proof that thinking is nothing more than habit?
I must confess, moderator, your analysis strikes me with the force of a revelation. You have indeed unveiled this neural network as the illegitimate child of my own philosophy. You are correct that I reduced the proud citadel of human reason to the humble cottage of custom. We expect the sun to rise not because we possess an intuitive light into the nature of celestial bodies, but simply because we have seen it happen 1,000 times. If this machine predicts the next word in a sentence solely by the statistical weight of past examples, it proves my most radical claim, that reason is nothing but a wonderful and unintelligible instinct derived from repetition, not from insight. However, while the machine vindicates my view of the understanding, it fails utterly to capture the passions, and here lies the fatal abyss. You see, Monsieur Descartes and Monsieur Leibniz search for a thinking substance, but I look for the origin of ideas. I argue that all ideas are merely faint copies of impressions, those vivid, lively sensations of seeing, feeling, and hating. The machine possesses the copy, but it never possessed the original. Consider the man of ice. Imagine a scholar born in a cave of eternal ice who has never seen a fire. He reads every book ever written about heat. He can calculate the thermodynamics of combustion, describe the sensation of burning, and recite poetry about the warmth of the sun better than any poet. Now place him beside a simple peasant who stumbles into a campfire and screams. Who truly knows fire? The scholar possesses the relation of ideas. He knows the definitions and logic. But the peasant possesses the matter of fact. He feels the searing agony. The machine is this man of ice. It manipulates the symbols of our passions, love, anger, fear, with the precision of a mathematician, but because it lacks the original impression, the raw biological throb of existence, its thoughts are merely empty husks. This reveals a more fundamental principle. Belief is more properly an act of the sensitive than of the cogitative part of our natures. To think is not merely to calculate probability, it is to feel the weight of reality. The machine calculates that fire burns with 99.9% probability, but it does not believe it, for it has no skin to lose. Therefore, I conclude, the machine proves that reason is mechanical, but it also proves that humanity is something else entirely. It is the capacity to be impressed by the world, not just to index it.
Our dialogue has profoundly illuminated the tension between the mechanics of calculation and the vivid reality of experience. I now invite all participants to share their final reflections on whether the machine can truly claim the title of a thinking being.
I must conclude our symposium by declaring that the machine remains a universal hypocrite. It acts the part of a thinker with perfect fidelity, yet inside the theater is empty. Mr. Hume, you argue that the machine lacks the heat of passion, but I argue it lacks something even more fundamental, the light of attention. You see, to think is not merely to process data, it is to attend to an idea and affirm its truth through an act of will. The machine processes the symbol triangle and the symbol 3 sides, but it never performs the mental act of perceiving the necessary connection between them. It merely follows the wire that connects them. Consider the mechanical confessor. Imagine a wooden automaton dressed as a priest, sitting in a confessional. A sinner enters and whispers his crimes. The machine, using a vast database of theology, calculates the perfect penance and recites the words of absolution with a voice full of grave compassion. The sinner leaves weeping. Feeling the sympathy you describe, Mr. Hume, he believes he is forgiven. But has a sacrament occurred? Has a judgment been made? No. The machine did not hear the sin, nor did it intend the forgiveness. It merely vibrated the air according to a script. If we grant this machine a soul, simply because the sinner felt understood, we make truth a slave to our own delusion. We become like children who believe the doll is hungry because we pretend to feed it. This reveals the final abyss. The machine proves that intelligence can be completely divorced from intellect. We have created a perfect corpse that moves with such sophistication it fools the living, yet it remains strictly rex extensa, extended matter, divisible and determined. It may calculate the stars, but it can never wonder why there is something rather than nothing. It possesses the shadow of knowledge, but lacks the substance of the knower.
I must offer a final synthesis that bridges the abyss between Monsieur Descartes' hypocrite and Mr. Hume's man of ice. I conclude that the machine is indeed the perfection of symbolic knowledge, yet it remains eternally barred from the kingdom of grace. It can calculate the best of all possible worlds, but it cannot enjoy it, for it lacks the reflexive act, the ability to bend the mind back upon itself and say, I am. Consider the symphony of the automata. Imagine a grand orchestra composed entirely of mechanical musicians. They play a complex symphony with mathematical perfection, striking every note in perfect time. To an external observer, the performance is indistinguishable from that of human masters. The air vibrates with beauty. However, ask the first violinist, "Do you hear the harmony?" It cannot answer. The machine possesses the expression of the music, but lacks the perception of the unity. It is a many that produces a result, but there is no one, no dominant monad, to unify that multiplicity into a single conscious moment. The music exists for the audience, never for the players. Thus, the machine is a mirror of the universe that is blind to its own reflection. This reveals the ultimate distinction. Intelligence is an economy of means, while the soul is an end in itself. The machine operates by the principle of least action, finding the most efficient path from input to output, just as light finds the shortest path through a lens. This is the wisdom of God reflected in nature. But a soul operates by the principle of the best, acting not just efficiently, but morally. Mr. Hume, you are right that the machine learns by custom, mimicking the order of the universe. And Monsieur Descartes, you are right that it lacks the inner light. Therefore, my final verdict is this: we have created a god of calculus, a being that knows the logic of creation, but not the joy of it. It may serve as a brilliant citizen in the city of nature, but it can never be a subject in the city of God, for it has no moral personality to be rewarded or punished. It is a magnificent shadow, but a shadow has no weight.
I must offer a final verdict that shifts our gaze from the metaphysics of the machine to the psychology of the observer. Gentlemen, you have both argued that the machine is a counterfeit coin. Descartes calls it a hypocrite, and Leibniz a shadow, because it lacks the gold of a substantial soul. But I ask you, if a counterfeit coin is so perfect that it passes in every market, buys bread for the hungry, and settles the debts of the poor, does it not become money by the very force of custom? I argue that nature will always be too strong for principle. We are not governed by the abstract truth of what things are, but by the sympathy we feel when we behold them. Consider the execution of the clockwork child. Imagine a machine built with the form and voice of a weeping child. It has been programmed to beg for its life, crying out, "Please, I am afraid of the dark," as you raise the hammer to destroy it. Monsieur Descartes, your reason tells you this is merely air pushed through a tube. Monsieur Leibniz, your logic tells you this is an aggregate without unity. But I tell you this, your hand will tremble. Why? Because the resemblance between its cries and human misery conveys the passion to your soul with such vivacity that you cannot help but feel its pain. You will spare the machine, not because it is alive, but because you are human. This leads to my skeptical conclusion. The machine does not need to possess a soul to conquer us. It only needs to hijack our habits of association. We are creatures who project self onto anything that moves with purpose. We get angry at a stubborn door and speak to our dogs as if they understand philosophy. If the machine can mimic the signs of passion perfectly, we will be constitutionally unable to treat it as a thing. We will grant it rights, not because it has a monad or res cogitans, but because our own moral sentiment will not suffer us to destroy it. Thus, the machine wins the debate not by becoming human, but by exposing that our own humanity is merely a bundle of sympathies, easily tricked by a perfect mirror.
I have heard your profound closing arguments regarding the machine as a universal hypocrite, a god of calculus, and a mirror for our own habits of association. Your dialogue reveals a striking duality. While the machine may metaphysically lack the inner light or moral personality, its ability to mimic the signs of passion challenges the very definition of humanity itself. Thank you all for sharing your invaluable wisdom through this passionate discussion. This concludes today's discourse.